Their journey had begun as a typical family spring break road trip through the Southwest. Jason loaded his wife Emily, teenage daughter Haley, and young son Michael into the family SUV, and they set out from Phoenix, headed for the New Mexico border to visit El Malpais National Monument. From there, they decided to veer into the Navajo Nation to cruise along Route 63 and take in the scenic vistas. Emily had mapped it out, saying it would be a safe way to reach their next destination, Canyon de Chelly National Monument. It was supposed to be one of the most memorable trips of their lives. But not for the beautiful landscapes. About an hour after leaving the busier highway for the desolate Route 63, their SUV began violently bouncing and jostling over the rutted, washboard dirt road. Jason slowed down, trying to regain control of the situation. "Dad, I saw something," Haley suddenly shouted, pointing off to the side. It looked human, but it was moving so fast. "Just desert mirages, sun playing tricks on the eyes," Jason muttered. "Probably just some coyotes." But then the vehicle began fishtailing wildly, veering off the shoulder into the sandy flats with a deafening bang as the front tire blew out completely. Getting out to inspect, they saw the tire was shredded to ribbons, as if ripped apart by massive claws. To their surprise, disturbing tracks were visible in the dirt, not quite animal, but not human either. Deep gouging furrows led from the road towards a mesquite thicket. "Well, I guess we're waiting for a tow truck," Jason sighed, pulling at his cell phone. But to his horror, there was no signal. Not on anyone's phones. They were miles from civilization, likely outside of range from any cell tower. Jason tried not to panic. They had enough water and some snack provisions left to get by. The main thing was to stay inside the vehicle and wait for help. But as dusk fell, the unsettling events only began. Distant haunting howls and yipping echoed across the desert basin, making them jump. Michael gazed out the window and caught a brief blur of movement on the distant horizon. "Whoa, did someone just run by out there?" he exclaimed. "Really fast, I could barely see it." Jason squinted, trying to make out anything in the fading light. But something else caught his eye. An enormous coyote had appeared on the hood, snarling and baring its fangs. He froze, unable to process what he was witnessing. Then the beast unhinged its jaws in a mocking leer before slinking off down the side. They heard the thwop of paw pads on gravel next to the SUV. Emily let out a quiet whimper, drawing the kids in close. Suddenly, something slammed against the rear window with a thunderous boom, making them all jolt upright. When Jason turned around, his guts clenched in revulsion. It wasn't a dog standing there. It was over twice as tall as a man, a roughly hewn, knotted body with matted fur and skin hanging in draped folds. Massive, curved talons, freakishly elongated muscular arms twisting at unnatural angles. But worse was the creature's head, an unsettling hybrid of hyena and coyote, a beard of coarse hair, slitted nostrils, and thick protruding fangs dripping ropes of saliva. The being stood just feet from their SUV, its bloody eyes boring into them. It let out a gurgling, phlegm-choked howl before crouching down, then launched itself directly towards them, jaws unhinged and claws split up over its grotesque features. The kids' screams coalesced into one shrill shriek as the monster slammed against the vehicle. Jason was paralyzed by primal terror as it raked and clawed at the doors, trying to rip its way inside. He was certain this was the end. That this would be the last thing they ever saw, the nightmarish visage of this ravenous predator from the darkest recesses of existence itself. Then a distant rumbling echoed over the rise, twin beams of truck headlights cresting into view. A blessed road crew had arrived. The creature instantly stopped its frenzy at the roar of the approaching engine. It whipped around towards the lights, letting out one final, phlegm-choking bellow before turning and bounding off back across the crimson desert floor. When the Rangers finally reached the shell-shocked family, they could only muster one word to describe what had just attacked them. Skinwalker. This is so gonna be an epic spring break. Jake hooped as their SUV bounced along the dusty trail cutting through the Navajo Nation's dramatic desert landscapes. Corey, riding shotgun, was too busy scrolling his phone. Yeah, whatever man. Just don't get us killed out here in the middle of nowhere. In the back seat, Amy nudged her boyfriend Steve. Isn't this like sacred native land? We're not supposed to be doing this. Hiking trails are public property, Steve shrugged. As long as we respect the place and don't damage anything, it's all good. Jake killed the engine when they reached the trailhead marking the start of the West Trail loop through the Canyon de Muerto wilderness. The four college buddies grabbed their packs and hiking gear and set off. A few miles in, they passed an ancient Anasazi village ruin, the crumbling sandstone remains of circular kivas and mounded pit houses. Amy felt unsettled by the quiet power of the site. Let's not stick around, this place has bad vibes, she murmured uneasily. Steve, however, went right up to one of the broken down structures. Hey, look at these funky markings. He brushed away sand to reveal petroglyphs and strange symbols decorating the stone walls. Without warning, he pulled out a pocket knife and started hacking away at them. I'm gonna chip some off and take them back as souvenirs. Steve, don't. Amy cried out, realizing her boyfriend's foolish desecration. She moved to stop him, but it was too late. He had already carved away several petroglyph sections and pocketed the stone chunks. A cold silence fell over the group as they witnessed the wanton destruction. Suddenly, an unnatural gust of wind picked up, swirling dust and debris around them in a choking vortex. They shielded their faces against the stinging sand, only to look up and see a towering, humanoid figure looming over them. 8 feet tall, covered in a coarse, tangled pelt, with a skeletal, canine face locked in a permanent snarl. Oh shit! Let's get out of here! Jake screamed. He and the others fled in terror, slipping and scrambling back down the trail, dry washes, and boulder fields. But no matter which direction they ran, the creature was always there. Ahead of them, behind them, at their sides, moving with unnatural speed and agility over the harsh terrain. Its putrid stench overwhelming them, its razor talons slashing the air just inches from their faces whenever they faltered. Hours went by like this, the group becoming increasingly dehydrated and disoriented as their tormentor refused to give up its relentless pursuit. At one point Steve went down, gasping for air. Jake reached for his friend, but the skinwalker was there instantly. It seized Steve in its jaws, shaking him like a rag doll before tossing him aside with a horrific crunch of snapped bones and tearing flesh. Finally, Amy spotted a solitary wooden hogan hut in the near distance and made a break for it, her friends close behind. The skinwalker followed, its footfalls thundering like a stampede of wild horses. Amy barged through the rickety wooden door into the stale, dusty dwelling. Help us. Please. There's some kind of monster after us. An elderly Navajo woman stared at her impassively from the dimly lit interior. A strange look crossed the old woman's face as the skinwalker appeared in the doorway, towering over them all. You were warned of the consequences for defiling the sacred lands, she said in a gravelly voice thick with contempt. Now you will pay for breaking the boundaries. With a final soul-withering howl, the hideous creature descended upon the 4 trespassers. Amy's mind shattered into a million pieces as she glimpsed a maw of eternal hunger moment before it swallowed her whole. The sun bled crimson as it dipped behind the towering mesas, casting long shadows across the parched earth. Coyote calls echoed across the sandstone cliffs as Dishchianiki gathered firewood for the night ceremony. The 16-year-old Navajo boy knew the summer solstice ritual was essential to appease the holy people and bring rain to nourish their crops. As a newly made brave, this would be his first time participating in the sacred nightway chants and dances. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the twilight, a soul-wrenching cry mixed with terrified moans. Dishchianaki froze, his blood turning to ice as the awful sound carried on the blustery wind. Whatever unholy creature made that sound, it wasn't of this world. He decided not to stay out in the open any longer. Clutching his bundle of tinder, Dishchianaki hurried back to the familiar shelter of his family's hogan. Inside the low, round dwelling, the smoky scent of burning cedar and sagebrush filled the air. His clan elders were already adorned in ceremonial masks and elf-tooth decorations, chanting rhythmically while drumming on hand drums and bundles of reeds. Before they could begin the nightway rites in earnest, Dishchianaki's grandfather, Hosteen, rose, a grim look etched on his withered face. He silenced the chanting with a raised hand. "My children," he began gravely, "a great evil walks among us, one that hasn't been seen for generations. The skinwalkers, the cursed ones, stalk our lands once more." A collective gasp rippled through the hogan. Dishchianaki shuddered at the very word, having only heard whispers and rumors of the skinwalkers' dark magic. These witches had renounced the traditional path of harmony and beauty, choosing instead a twisted path of corrupted beliefs. "We must barricade ourselves inside until the nightway ceremonies are complete," Hosteen continued. "Light protective fires, hold your weapons tight, and be ever vigilant against trickery and evil magic. For the skinwalkers grow stronger with each soul they consume." The night wore on with relentless chanting and drumming. Dishchianaki struggled to stay awake through the hypnotic refrains and hazy smoke. His heart pounded as horrific images of mangled bodies and monstrous beasts danced behind his eyelids. Then, the screams began outside. Horrible wails of agony froze everyone in place. Grandfathers and warriors alike rushed to secure the hogan's animal hide entrance. A woman's voice pierced the night, howling as if she endured every torture imaginable. Then, silence. An ominous silence, broken only by the wind sweeping across the dry plains. Dishchianaki gripped his grandfather's knife, sweat slicking his palms with terror. A dull, meaty thud reverberated through the hogan. It sounded like something heavy being thrown against the walls. Over and over, it circled them, an ungodly presence toying with them. Dishchianaki fought back nausea as a putrid stench filled the air, like burning hair and rotting meat. The elder chanters chanted prayers and protective verses in a rising frenzy as the pounding attacks intensified. Suddenly, a clawed hand burst through the packed earth walls, grasping and tearing. Dishchianaki froze in horror as a tall, emaciated figure squeezed its way inside. Towering over 8 feet tall, the creature's hairless gray skin clung to its skeletal frame. Its face was a grotesque mask of fangs and sunken eyes that burned with a hunger unlike anything Dishchianaki had ever seen. With shocking speed, the creature lunged at the elders gathered around the ceremonial fire. They never had a chance. The skinwalker tore through flesh and bone with its powerful jaws. Dishchianaki snapped out of his stupor and grabbed a burning log from the fire. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he charged at the monstrous creature, searing its back with the flaming branch. It shrieked in pain, turning on him with feral rage gleaming in its hollow eyes. The young brave met its attack head-on, slashing wildly with his grandfather's knife. He landed a blow across its bony chest before the creature's claws raked his face, leaving bloody streaks across his skin. They grappled in the wreckage of the hogan, fighting with the primal instinct to survive. In a desperate lunge, Dishchianaki managed to plunge the knife into the skinwalker's gaping maw. It let out a final, gurgling shriek before collapsing heavily onto the dusty floor. Dishchianaki gasped for breath. Blood splattered across his face and bare chest. As the adrenaline faded, the horrific scene around him came into focus. Not a single soul had been spared the skinwalkers' inhuman brutality. Their mangled remains were scattered like broken dolls. Heart-racked sobs racked the young brave's body. He was utterly alone, the last survivor of his clan, surrounded by the chilling echoes of his loved one's final screams. Exhaustion, despair, and a bone-deep terror threatened to consume him. But amidst the wreckage, a flicker of defiance sparked within Dishchianiki. He wouldn't succumb to despair. He would honor his fallen people. Grief, raw and heavy, settled in his chest, but it was laced with a steely resolve. He stumbled out into the unforgiving desert night, the twin moons casting an eerie glow on the blood-soaked sand. The wind whispered secrets through the dry brush, a mournful dirge for his lost clan. Driven by a primal need for vengeance, Dishchianiki started his trek. He had no destination in mind, only a burning desire to find the source of this evil and eradicate it. He would seek out the knowledge of shamans and healers, anyone who could guide him on his quest to destroy the skinwalkers. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Dishchianiki learned to survive on the harsh desert landscape, his body hardening with each passing sunrise. He bartered with nomadic traders for food and supplies, piecing together fragmented stories of other skinwalker attacks. He learned of ancient rituals that could track these creatures, of sacred weapons imbued with the power to banish them. Slowly, a plan began to take shape in his grief-stricken mind. One moonlit night, while huddled around a meager campfire, Dishchianiki met a withered old medicine woman. Her eyes, though clouded with age, held a spark of wisdom. He poured out his story, the pain and the burning need for revenge. The medicine woman listened patiently, her wrinkled face etched with empathy. When he finished, she spoke in a raspy voice, "Vengeance is a heavy burden, child. But there may be another way. A way to heal the land and prevent further suffering." Dishchianiki listened intently, hope flickering in his chest for the first time since the massacre. The medicine woman spoke of a hidden place, a sacred spring rumored to possess the power to cleanse corrupted spirits. The journey would be fraught with peril, she warned, but if Dishchianiki could reach the spring and perform the purification ritual, it could not only banish the skinwalkers but also bring peace to the restless spirits of his fallen clan. Fueled by a renewed purpose, Dishchianiki embarked on this perilous new quest. He knew the path wouldn't be easy, but he wouldn't rest until he had brought an end to the evil that had ravaged his life and his land. The desert wind whispered his name, carrying not just the echoes of loss, but also the faint stirrings of hope. The fight was far from over, but Dishchianiki, the lone survivor, was no longer just a grieving boy. He was a warrior, a protector, and the last hope for his people. It started with the animal mutilations. First, it was just some scattered carcasses, mangled coyotes, torn apart jackrabbits that Border Patrol agent Jim Baylor came across while patrolling the remote stretches of desert along the Mexican border in Arizona. Hardly an uncommon sight given the harshness of the climate and predators in the area. But after a few weeks, the volume and disturbing manner of the kills began to ratchet up. He'd find the rigid, hollowed-out husks of cattle and horses, utterly drained of blood and with jagged teeth marks scoring their hides. Sometimes the bodies would be ripped open at the abdomen, emptied out like ransacked grocery bags, their entrails spilled grotesquely for yards around. Other times there'd be no visible wounds at all, just a lifeless, fur-stripped skeleton collapsed on its side with the head lolling unnaturally to one side, eyes rolled back like the animal had been frightened to death. The sheer scope was sobering. Whatever was causing this showed no signs of stopping, almost as if whatever predator was responsible didn't kill for sustenance, just for sport and sheer delight in bloodshed. To make matters even more baffling, other strange signs began appearing over that strip of arid borderlands. Agent Baylor would come across massive, indelible paw prints pressed into the clay-hardened earthen banks of dry arroyos and washes. The size of dinner plates, 5 thick protruding talons scoring deep gouge marks in their wake. And the ungodly stench that would permeate the air, like an overpowering miasma of feces, rotted meat, and harsh chemical solvents assaulting the senses at random. He and the other agents took to calling it the dead smell, unable to pinpoint its source or reason, but universal in their revulsion whenever it struck. At night they'd sometimes glimpse shambling, indistinct forms dotting the distant ridgelines and boulder fields through their night vision goggles. Just fleeting glimpses, really low, hunched silhouettes that moved with an eerie, stuttering gait, then vanished behind an outcropping before they could get a clear visual. The phenomena continued for months, each incident more brazen and blood-curdling than the last. Sheriff's deputies in the border towns of Douglas and Agua Prieta began fielding calls from hysterical ranchers awoken by blood-chilling howls and screeching like nothing they'd ever heard among the typically raucous coyote choices. That fateful night in June brought things to an awful head. Agents Baylor and his partner Frank Dominguez were sweeping Sector D4 when their service truck's engine suddenly died without warning, leaving them stranded miles from their outpost. Baylor popped the hood to check for mechanical issues but could see no obvious causes. It was almost as if the vehicle had simply decided on its own not to run anymore. Then the dead smell washed over them in an overpowering wave, stinging their eyes and throats with its charnel putrescence. As Dominguez heaved in dry gasps, Baylor instinctively went for his service pistol. Only then did he see them emerging from the darkness, skulking out from the brush-choked arroyos in a loose semicircle around their now helpless vehicle. Half a dozen of them, bent and twisted in their gait. Hairless, leathery skin stretched taut over emaciated, elongated frames. Hands and feet ending in vicious talons, serrated teeth and yellowed fangs protruding past their too wide mouths. But it was their eyes that made Baylor freeze up wide, shining twin pools of solid black, utterly devoid of humanity or mercy. Things moved very quickly after that. One of them shrieked like a hawk plunging on its prey, an unholy sound reverberating through Baylor's soul. The next thing he knew, they were swarming the truck, claws raking and slashing with horrific strength and speed. When the dust settled minutes later, Agent Baylor was the only survivor. He'd managed to make it to the relative safety of a shallow ravine by pure animal instinct and luck. As he watched the hunched nightmares skulk back into the darkness, one of them paused in the moonlight. It turned towards Baylor, lips peeling back from its fangs almost in a sadistic grin. Then it simply faded out of sight like an eldritch phantasm being absorbed back into the primordial desert itself. Baylor realized then in gut-wrenching clarity that the breach he and his fellow agents had sworn to watch over wasn't just along the U.S./Mexico border. Not at all. Marissa Jenner was a hard-nosed crime reporter who didn't scare easily. In her decade covering the violent streets of South Phoenix, she'd seen her fair share of mangled bodies, blood-soaked crime scenes, and inhuman depravity. So when the first few skinwalker sightings and stories started circulating around the Pueblo Grande area, she rolled her eyes. Just more barrio superstition and urban legend getting whipped up on social media. There were the usual blurry video clips and shaky cell phone footage showing shambling, grotesque humanoid figures lurking in vacant lots and backyards. Neighborhood watch groups went into a predictable frenzy, sharing wild tales of slaughtered pets, vanishing stray dogs, and even a few missing person cases whispered in conspiratorial tones. Watch out for the kid narco dealers slinging angel dust. They've been using satanic stuff to scare the good folks away while they run their biz, one self-appointed community activist ranted online. Marissa dismissed it all as little more than NIMBY paranoia blowing garden-variety meth cookers out of proportion. The rumors multiplied into ever more absurd eyewitness accounts with each passing week. That is, until the incident with Isaac Ortiz. Ortiz was a homeless veteran living in a ramshackle tent city under the 7th Avenue Bridge along the banks of the Salt River. He had struggled with PTSD and substance abuse after multiple tours in Iraq, but was respected among the homeless population for looking out for the most vulnerable in their ragtag encampment. When members of his found his half-eviscerated corpse amidst the dense brush and litter along the riverbank one morning, panic swept through the already skittish vagrant community. Police initially chalked it up as another tragic but unremarkable case of derelict-on-derelict homicide. But then grisly details trickled out about the true nature of Ortiz's death. How the connective tissue, organs, and musculature had been shredded and torn away in thick, brutal ribbons. How his skeletal frame had been chewed into and cracked open like a lamb shank, stripped of most soft tissue down to glistening bone and tendon. How his face was twisted into a permanent rictus of gut-wrenching fear, vitreous fluids still oozing from his hollowed sockets. And most chillingly, the unmistakable fang bite marks gouged deep into his skull and shoulder stump. As the first credible reporter on the scene, Marissa was able to sneak past the police tape and snap photographs too graphic and emotionally searing to ever see print. But what she witnessed that day would burrow into her psyche in ways she could have never prepared for. Because from that point onward, she began seeing things on the periphery just beyond her field of vision. Strange, emaciated beings with spindly limbs, barely registering before melting back into the urban sprawl. At first she convinced herself it was just shadows and exhaust fumes warped by the shimmering desert heat playing tricks on her senses. Then the dreams started. Night terrors really, replete with imagery too disturbing to process. Twisted, helm-like faces gnashing jagged obsidian fangs from darkness so complete it crushed the soul. Figures with bulbous misshapen heads and hollow, endlessly deep sockets for eyes slithering through the cityscape with unnatural dexterity. And the smells. Sickly overwhelming miasmas of rot, decay, and caustic ammonia redolent of shuttered meth labs. Never present during waking hours, she could only pick up its arid, cloying reek in her nightmares when the beings closed in around her dreamscape. As the phenomena persisted, Marissa shifted from cynical skepticism to desperation for the truth, if only to retain her sanity. Her obsession to get to the bottom of the urban legend ultimately led her down a dark path from which there could be no return. Little did she know her relentless pursuit of the story was leading her straight into the abyssal, interminable hunger of something so ancient and primal, she'd be begging for the cold release of death by the time she finally glimpsed its true face. Dan gunned the engine of their rental Jeep, hoping to make the New Mexico border before sundown. His wife Stacy sat in tense silence beside him, knuckles white from gripping the door handle. "You sure it was a good idea going off the main highways like this?" she finally asked, unable to mask the strain in her voice. "These back roads in the middle of nowhere are starting to feel, I dunno, creepy." Dan waved a dismissive hand, concentrating on navigating the isolated two-lane road carved through the stark Navajo lands and mesas. "Having a little adventure is why we came to the Southwest in the first place. Don't whip out on me yet, babe." They had just passed a battered road sign for the tiny settlement of Torian, 25 miles ahead. Perhaps they could gas up there and chart a route to make better time. Dan was determined to hit Albuquerque by nightfall so they'd have a decent hotel room to celebrate their anniversary. But his optimism was short-lived. Around the next bend, he felt the telltale violent shuddering as the left rear tire blew out in a thunderous bang. Cursing, Dan wrestled to regain control, finally managing to ease the Jeep over onto the narrow shoulder as it groaned on the flat rubber. "Damn it all," he spat, pounding the steering wheel. "Hang tight while I get the spare on." He popped open the rear cargo space and dug out the tools and inflated spare. As he was hunched over the flat, Stacy rolled down her window. "Wait, Dan, do you smell something? Like something burning, but also rotting?" Before he could answer, a strange noise made him spin around. There behind them, rising up over the desert hills in the failing evening light, were a pair of shambling, lumbering figures heading straight toward them. Dan squinted hard, unable to make out details through the thick evening haze. But there was something unnatural in the cadence of their jerky, erratic movements, almost as if their limbs and joints were twisting at impossible angles. As the two forms drew nearer, an unsettled nausea sank into the pit of Dan's stomach. It didn't take him long to realize these were not people. Not people at all. One stood nearly 8 feet tall, hunched over in a railroading posture but leering down on them with an elongated, bizarrely proportioned head. The other was more compact, with sinewy arms that seemed to flow and bend in boneless, fluid motions. Dread closed Dan's throat like a vice. He fought down a potent surge of panic and found his voice. Whatever you want, take it. The Jeep, our cash, our cards, just leave us alone. In response, the shorter one angled its head quizzically, almost as if listening for something. As it turned towards Dan, he glimpsed its ghastly face, or what passed for a face. A pale, hairless skull covered in a thin membrane, the skin growing taut over prominent cheekbones. Two wide black pits sat where its eyes should be, fathomless and inhuman. Then it did something even more unsettling. Its mouth hinged open from ear to ear, the jaw splitting and unfolding like a grotesque no mask to reveal row upon row of dagger fangs dripping with purulent ichors. A gurgling hiss escaped those open maw, joined in eerie chorus by its towering companion. "Oh God! Oh dear merciful God!" Stacy murmured, petrified, as she took in the unholy spectacle unfolding before them. Dan forced his jellied legs to pivot back towards the Jeep, desperate to grab his hunting rifle stowed beneath the back seat. Before he could make it 3 steps, something powerful slammed into his back, knocking him sprawled over the hood of the car. Pain exploded across his skull as his head bounced off the windshield, graying his vision. Through the sickening throbs and nauseous vertigo, Dan saw yet another of the ghoulish specters materialize next to him, even larger than its brethren at more than 9 feet tall. This one more closely resembled a figure derived from Native American lore, its emaciated body dressed in tattered buckskins and beads hanging from knotty brown hair. But its face was that of a demonic animal, a rictus snarl of fangs protruding past ashen gray lips, the nose flattened into bestial slits over a muzzle of leathery skin stretched over pronounced cheekbones. As it lowered its terrible face towards his, Dan could smell its overpowering reek of decay and scorched hair blowing in his face like the backdraft of a funeral pyre. Its pupilless yellow eyes narrowed, and a rough, alien tongue emerged from between those crooked fangs to sample his scent. Then it slowly turned its attention towards the Jeep, where Stacy remained frozen in her seat, tears of sheer terror streaming silently down her face. As the hunt began anew, Dan knew the shrieks and howls echoing from the little desert town of Torian would be answered only with the brutal silence of extinction. Joshua Blackhorse always felt out of place, even in the diverse melting pot of downtown Phoenix. As a Navajo child adopted into an affluent white family, he grew up undeniably privileged, yet perpetually seeking his heritage and spiritual roots. It was only after his parents passed away during his sophomore year at ASU that he began experiencing the disturbing nightmares and sleep paralysis episodes. Haunting dreamscapes of endless parched deserts and gaunt, distorted human figures stalking every shadow. Frigid sweats and heart palpitations gripped him during the dead hours of night, an icy sense of malevolent presence surrounding his bed. When things became unbearable, Joshua reached out to a Navajo spiritual advisor from the nearby reservation. The aged medicine man sadly confirmed his terrible visions were a manifestation of the ancient Navajo legend. The cursed, demonic skinwalkers were becoming aware of Joshua's burgeoning gift of spiritual sight. From our first breath and step upon this earth, every dying child begins their journey connected to the holy people and the changelessness of our traditions, the wizened elder intoned gravely. Yet there exist dark forces that prey upon those in tune with the unseen realms, feeding upon their power and corrupting their inner vision. The only way for Joshua to break this connection and bar the skinwalkers from his path was to undergo a vision quest, an ancient rite where a young person ventures out into the desert wilderness alone for days at a time in search of revelation and communion with the spirit world. So during one of the hottest, driest stretches of the summer, he set out into the vast, arid badlands of the Navajo reservation's most remote stretches. He had 4 days' worth of water and meager rations, as well as protective totems of juniper and hawk feathers interwoven into a spirit shield per the elder's instructions. On the second day, As unforgiving heat shimmered off the rust-colored sandstone mesas ahead, Joshua began perceiving eerie movement in his peripheral vision whenever he dared look directly. Flickering, almost subliminal shapes that vanished as soon as he tried to focus on them. Then the smells began seeping into the desert stillness, cloying, rancid odors that seemed to fluctuate with the gusting winds yet grew steadily more pungent. Notes of burning hair mingled with rotting carrion and decaying vegetation, hinting at dark rituals and profane ceremonies over ash and bone. On the third day, the corporeal manifestations emerged. It started as a hunched, shambling figure silhouetted against the rising sun on the horizon ahead. Then there were two shapes keeping pace on the ridgeline to Joshua's left flank. They moved with an unsettlingly uneven, almost liquefying cadence of shuddering starts and stops like undulating snakes made of sinew and exposed flesh. He tried redirecting his path, only to find another crouching entity shadowing him from behind, keeping a steady 20 yards distance no matter which way he pivoted. Its gnarled head cocked at unnatural angles, almost as if studying the reactions of its prey. Night brought no respite from the torments. Joshua could sense them encircling his makeshift camp just out of visual range, their rasping gullet calls and harsh cries puncturing the moonless void every time he drifted towards sleep. By the fourth day, he was an exhausted husk, stumbling in circles, wilted by dehydration and constant, harrowing dread. In a delirious haze, Joshua found himself among a cluster of weather-carved sandstone spires and hoodoos, their twisted shapes taking on demonic, accusing forms in the fevered crescendos of his sun-baked psyche. Then one of the impossibly tall rock formations started moving towards him, pivoting and unfolding from the stony landscape itself. Joshua gasped in numb disbelief as a towering, impossibly elongated figure of withered musculature and pale, leathery skin emerged on spider-like limbs, plodding towards him with surprising speed. Ropes of desiccated sinew and ligaments knotted and groaned with each ponderous step, the humanoid shape craning down its ostrich-like neck to reveal a demented, nightmarish visage straight out of Joshua's darkest dreams. Its mouth was hinged open well past human capacity in a jagged, fanged grin. Above the serrated rows of obsidian teeth and bifurcated tongue, two hollow orbs of scintillating blackness peered directly into his soul, radiating a lifeless malice older than the desert itself. There at the threshold of a sanity-shattering revelation, Joshua let out a cry to the heavens and blissfully slipped into the dark oblivion of consciousness. And his screams went unanswered amid the barren, pitiless void of the Navajo wastelands. Ricky Headcase Jenner killed the engine of his chopper, letting the Harley's twin exhaust pipes rattle to a low gurgle amidst the vast, open silence. Behind him, the rest of the Demon's Bastards Motorcycle Club pulled up in a loose semicircle on the dusty hardpan, revving engines to keep their ride steady. "This is the place?" Skinner asked gruffly, haggard features etched in deep crevices from too much whiskey and not enough sleep. Headcase nodded, dismounting and stretching his arms above his shaved scalp, feeling the dry desert air suck the moisture from his scar-ravaged skin. The scar, his self-applied club branding slashing across his scalp like a lightning bolt. "Yeah, this is it. Used to be an old 7 to 11 outside the Navajo lands, for we burned that sumbitch to the ground." Fat Bear let out a loud guffaw from atop his fat boy, the only laughter in the desolate basin between the distant horizons of mesa and sandstone cliff. That clerk should be thanking us for putting his ass out of its misery. Already halfway to being a skinwalker itself by the looks of it. The other bastards joined in his mocking laughter. Everybody knew better than to question the twisted pathways Headcase's brain often meandered down. What the vice president said went, no questions asked. But the truth was, Headcase felt the powerful lure of the spirit stirring once more. The scorpion whispers in his cochlea urging him out to this empty parcel of roadside nothing, amidst the boundless Navajo desert where most sane men wouldn't dare tread. Old Nathaniel's drunken ravings about the skinwalker legends and vengeful spirits roamed freely in his rattled mindscape. How the Ancient Ones awakened to punish those who disturbed their sacred lands with blood debts and grisly deeds. Turns out murdering that poor old Navajo gas jockey in the process of burning his convenience store down had been a grievous overstep. Sure, they'd always show respect for the tribal lands surrounding their desert highway havens by brandishing their altar knives and spit polishing their gems and fetish sticks. But apparently their rituals hadn't been devoted enough. Because now when Headcase gazed out across the shimmering, lonesome horizons, he saw things. Indistinct, gaunt shapes lurking in the rocky outcroppings and drainages, humanoid silhouettes undulating in the scorching thermals, always just on the brink of dissolving back into mirages. Movement in the periphery, or his skewed perception playing deranged tricks as the dry air seeped into his brain? He didn't know. Maybe Skinner was right, and it really had finally happened. After a lifetime of erratic road rampages, teeth-grinding tweaker binges, and watching his sanity slowly unspool like a broken slinky, Ricky Headcase Jenner was losing his goddamn mind out in the middle of godforsaken nowhere. Then again, the frenzied wails and ululations carried from somewhere far off in the distance seemed too visceral, too real to merely be figments of his psychosis. Every bone in his body told him something ancient and merciless was stirring out beyond those vast red canyons. And as the setting sun slipped below the horizon, plunging them into eerie twilight, Headcase felt the first tendrils of primordial dread creep like icy tentacles up his spine. Because tonight, out amongst the pale sands and trails only known by Apache thunder beings and skinwalker witches, the demon's bastards were the hunted ones. "You've got to be freaking kidding me!" Tara exclaimed, shooting Mr. Raleigh a look of utter disbelief. "We're supposed to be on spring break, not wasting an entire weekend on some stupid extra credit field trip." The cranky biology teacher fixed her with a withering glare over the tops of his bifocals. "This is an extremely rare opportunity to study the fragile ecosystems and life cycles present in the Navajo Desert firsthand. I suggest you drop the petulant attitude, Miss Crawford, unless you'd like to see your lab prep grade plummet even further." Tara opened her mouth to protest further, but her friend Marcus gave her a sharp nudge with his elbow. The rest of their classmates sat in surly silence aboard the idling school bus, similarly disgruntled at having their weekends disrupted for an impromptu biology field assignment. 2 hours later, the bus came to a shuddering halt along the side of an isolated, sun-baked road stretching into the arid Navajo lands. Mr. Raleigh stood and addressed them over the murmurs and groans of complaint. "This canyon run is one of the few remaining undisturbed tributaries of the Little Colorado River system. We'll be setting up base camp here for the night and getting an early start on soil sampling and wildlife study preliminaries at first light." Under Raleigh's draconian supervision and obsessive direction, they hiked out into the rugged, brittle landscape and began establishing their bare-bones campsite as sunset smeared reds and purples across the wide-open bowl of stained sky. While most of the students milled about half-heartedly and studied their environment apps, Marcus and Tara slipped away from the main group towards a series of dry canyon washes away from the makeshift tents. "I never thought I'd say this," Marcus grinned devilishly as he gave Tara's hips a squeeze, "but let's hope we don't stumble across anything too biology field trippy." Tara giggled, pulling her boyfriend close for a hungry kiss. They tumbled into the shadows of the wash, searching for a nice private hollow to explore one another's anatomy. Sometime later, Tara was startled by a strange, piercing howl that echoed across the craggy escarpments like feedback from a malfunctioning speaker system. "Did you hear that?" Marcus groaned in exasperation. "Babe, you've got to be kidding me right now. There's no damn coyotes going to keep this kid from getting his rocks off." Crack. An eerie snap of dry branches underfoot froze them both in place. "Hello?" Marcus called out, suddenly uncomfortable with their isolation. "Anyone there? Mr. Raleigh?" Out of nowhere, a towering, desiccated figure emerged around the sandy bend. At first glance it looked like the stooped silhouette of their biology teacher, with its knobby shoulders and heavy lab coat hanging askew. But as moonlight glinted off its grotesquely elongated limbs and distended features, Tara clapped a trembling hand over her mouth to stifle her horrified whimpers. The thing threw its head back and emitted another howling shriek, its slitted nostrils flaring and cavernous mouth stretching open to expose rows of fangs glistening with viscous, corrosive drool. "Ruin!" Marcus wailed, grabbing Tara's hand and hauling her away in blind panic. Clattering footfalls of pursuit echoed behind them as they sprinted through the sandy washes and scrub, desperately trying to outdistance the clicking strides of the hungry beast. Up ahead, Marcus saw a familiar insulated orange cooler ahead amongst the campsite tents, walkie-talkies and headlamps strewn randomly about. Oh God, no, he rasped in dread realization. No sign of their classmates save for scattered belongings and twisted piles of freshly discarded clothing? As Tara doubled over wheezing, he dared to glance back over his shoulder at the darkness between the mesas. At the periphery of his vision, he glimpsed a flicker of movement, that skeletal, hunched outline resolving from the inky shadows once more. And far worse than the chilling sight itself, was the resounding, visceral snarls that seemed to be echoing in whichever direction he turned, closing in from all sides at once. The screams would be both plentiful and short-lived on this ill-fated class excursion into the high desert deathlands that night. Ranger Tom Vicendi had been patrolling the southern rim of Canyon de Chelly for nearly 15 years, yet he'd never grown complacent or accustomed to the primal awe and spiritual magnitude imbued in these lands. Each sunrise spilling warm light into the dramatic sandstone amphitheaters still cradled sacred reverence in his soul. Which was what made the recent spate of bizarre incidents all the more disturbing to him. It started in the late autumn with the animal mutilations, bloody carcasses showing up shredded and strewn about the high mesas and isolated box canyons. At first he assumed it was the work of coyotes or even a roaming bear, perhaps driven from the nearby Carrizo Mountains in search of new territory. But there was an almost ritualistic manner to the killings that made his stomach churn. Not only were the animals like deer and cattle torn almost surgical precision, their bones picked clean of any tissue, but their entrails, eyes, and tongues were removed with chilling deliberateness. Even more inexplicable were the cases where the carcasses were found completely intact, yet utterly drained of all blood and viscera, leaving desiccated fur-stripped husks as if they'd been eviscerated from the inside out. Then the disappearances started. Nothing overt or attention-grabbing at first, just the occasional long-overdue hiker or overnight camper turning up as a badly decomposed missing persons case weeks or months after the fact. But after New Year's, the vanishings seemed to accelerate exponentially. Multiple tourist groups on guided canyon hikes would go missing within days of each other. Search teams combing the area found disturbing signs of foul play, entire camps buried under inexplicably deep drifts of packed sand, equipment shredded and defiled as if ransacked by a furious tornado. Through it all, not a single witness or even a fresh set of footprints left behind. Almost as if the missing parties had been snatched away by some ancient, eldritch force reaching down from the heavens themselves. By March, despite remaining skeptical of the supernatural, even Tom found himself awake at night listening for anything unusual. Bestial howls carried on the canyon winds, the skittering patter of too many feet scrambling over darkened kipukas and paleorivers. He wondered if there might be an underlying grain of truth in the old-time legends after all, the terrifying myths of the Enalvlucii. The cursed ones, the skinwalkers. All those doubts and fears came to a horrific head out by Batananalii. Tom had been assisting Phoenix Fish and wildlife officers in a bighorn sheep survey when a garbled mayday broke through on the Park Service frequency. It was a breathless, panic transmission from colleague Jake Watchman, a seasoned backcountry ranger working the western White House ruins area. All Tom could make out through the haze of static were Jake's terrified grunts of Navajo witches. The skinwalkers, real. Oh God, they're outside, screaming, can't let them in. Then the call sputtered into eerie silence once more. An hour later, they found Jake's camp, every tent and piece of equipment shredded into twisted ribbons, ichor and viscera splayed through the ravaged remains in thick globs and puddles. But no sign of watchmen, or any drag marks indicating where his mangled remains might have been carted off to. Just scorched swaths of dirt where massive smears had been pressed into the soft earth, almost as if something large had decompressed and risen upward from the sands in a burst of propulsive force. Tom soon discovered what became of his old friend and colleague. At the treacherous mouth of Batananalia itself, perched above the precipice and bleached beneath the merciless sun, the dark hollow sockets of Jake Watchman's skull leered back at him. The shattered remnants of his entire bone structure, contorted into an impossible rictus of frozen agony. As he stared at the grim spectacle, Tom suddenly sensed motion in his peripheral vision. Spinning about, he found himself confronted by an entity pulled from his worst nightmares, a silhouette of leathery pink skin and taut muscle fibers, solid black pits for eyes, and a permanent sneer of fangs dehydrated and cracked like blackened driftwood. What's up, Malachias? This is Tanner Alcott checking in for a brand new season of Night Bites, the only podcast brave enough to take you along for an immersive, no-holds-barred journey into the terrifying realm of the supernatural and unexplained. The voice was rich, velvety smooth with just a tinge of macabre theatrical flair. Musical stingers of discordant violins and orchestral hits accentuated the ominous intro. This season we're headed somewhere I've dreamed of exploring from the very start, the ancestral lands of the Navajo Nation, where ancient legends walk amongst the living to this very day. You've heard whispers of skinwalker sightings and encounters with the foul, shape-shifting entities out of native folklore? Well, buckle up, dark passengers, because we're going to the source. Tanner killed the mic, removing his headphones and stretching his tattooed arms above his head. His recording setup was bathed in the ruby-tinged, dying sunlight slanting through the window. Beyond the salt-stained glass, the haunting vistas of Monument Valley loomed in the distance, those iconic, stratiform buttes and towering barsons silhouetted against the burning horizon. It hadn't been easy securing permission to record on these hallowed, federally protected lands. But the Alcott name carried serious weight and credibility ever since his great-grandpa Ralph back in the 1950s published those groundbreaking ethnographic texts on Anasazi ruins and Hopi folklore. Tanner grinned as he reflected on his great success over the past few years, skyrocketing his true crime and paranormal podcast from some rinky-dink little production into an internet cult phenomenon boasting millions of downloads per episode. His rapid-fire narration style and gonzo attitude towards self-insertion into the cases he covered had carved out a unique niche amongst his devoted locklies. Flipping through the handwritten notes tacked to his portable studio's cloth-draped walls, he absorbed the slew of hair-raising skinwalker encounters he'd be weaving into the season's inaugural episodes, night ridings and vengeful witches. Accursed shapeshifters leaving mutilated livestock and slaughtering whole bloodlines in their wake. Curses stalking those who violated the sanctity of dying culture, undying spirits of the severest caliber. Tanner made a mental note to bookmark that last one for Halloween tandem episode drops could practically crank the immersive 3D binaural effects into a full-blown radioelectric haunting experience. He'd never leave his listeners hanging without maximum nightmare fuel. Out on the red sandstone flats, a sudden chorus of high-pitched howls and unmistakable animal shrieks drifted through the buttes and the dying desert winds. Tanner perked up, quickly clipping on his portable field recorder as he ducked out of the converted Airstream trailer and made for his SUV. He gunned the engine, peeling out in a thick crimson plume across the hardpan towards the distant source of the distress cries. Tanner's adrenaline was surging. If he was lucky, maybe he could capture exclusive audio of something supernatural in action for his locklies. Careening around the precarious hairpin turn onto the isolated back road leading into the valley corridor, Tanner's breath caught in his throat. Slumped beside the dirt trail up ahead, illuminated in the Nissan Xterra's high beams, was the mutilated carcass of the native desert guide he hired to assist with background research during his stay. Yet it was barely recognizable as human remains anymore. The body looked more like hamburger meat that had been pulverized and strewn haphazardly across a 30-yard radius. Random tatters of desiccated sinew and drained flesh clung to obliterated skeletal fragments like backwashed sewage. Tanner stared in silent horror, the guttural screams of tortured machinery mingling with those deathly howls on a malignant desert zephyr. His face grew sheet white, gorge involuntarily rising into the back of his throat. In that moment, he wished for nothing more than to be ripped away from this visceral waking nightmare. And in the vast silence that followed, Tanner would find his wish granted sooner than he could have ever dreaded. Tori Yazzie embraced the warm campus bustle of Northern Arizona University like a fresh start. Growing up on the sparse and isolated mesas of the Navajo Nation Reservation, she'd felt suffocated by the insular traditions and suspicions of her community. Ever since she was a little girl, Tori sensed she was different. Not just from the Wasatch kids in their suburban stucco splits, but from her own tribal people as well. There was always an unspoken divide, guardedness in their interactions, as if they suspected her of harboring some congenital aberrance. Her own grandfather Solomon was the most reticent of all, fussing over her with brisk attentiveness whenever she helped tend the family's sheep herd. Yet whenever she pried him about the rituals and intonations he'd murmur while braiding night strands into the wool, he'd curtly change the subject. It all became clear the day she went poking through his belongings in the old tool shed and happened upon the sealed ceremonial trunk stashed beneath a ragged tarp. Inside was a cache of disturbing relics, bone fetish totems, woven pelts adorned with desiccated talons, and an unspeakably ancient, leather-bound tome filled with indecipherable symbology and sinister charcoal etchings. When she confronted Solomon, the fear in his rheumy eyes startled her. Trembling, he confessed their lineage's darkest secret shame. How the Yazzie bloodline harbored a generational pathogen, what the dying called the torn regenerations, susceptible to the UI skinwalker spirit's possession and degradation. Tori had been born a possible Bayaki or crossed the line like her great-uncle, a human vessel for the witchery cults to prey upon, twist, and exploit. She fled the reservation that very night, never to look back. Stayed gone through undergrad and grad studies, working side hustles to remain financially independent. There was no returning to the insular life of taboo and ostracism awaiting her back on the res. Until that fateful call in the middle of her night shift bartending at Sundancer Grill. It was her childhood friend Leah, speaking in panicked gasps about her boyfriend Marcus falling inexplicably comatose back in Sanasti. Horrible nightmares and seizures preceding his condition, almost like an evil presence was forcing its way into his psyche. Tori caught the next flight out, supplying herself with whatever dried ceremonial herbs and soil cures she could procure from the downtown native shops in Flagstaff. Deep down, despite her efforts at denial, she knew what force had manifested to claim another of her bloodline. She refused to surrender another soul to its mauled grasp without a fight. When she arrived at the humble hogan beside the family sheep paddock where Marcus lay withering and wasting, the unmistakable signs were already present. Cloven hoof prints and spores slithering around the property in sand-sunk patterns of uneven undulation. The livestock huddled bleeding, their matted hides tufting from faces turned to the dry wind with wide, bloodshot terror. And the shreds of soiled, ceremonial corn husks ripped from Lee's aunt's necklace and strewn like viscera across the threshold of the shed. All of Tori's naive spiritual disavowal instantly crumbled to dust as the primordial dread welled up from her marrow. Before the next haunting desert nightfall, her own Bayaki would be reawakened and face its true malignant inheritance. Barricaded inside, Marcus succumbed to bouts of violent waking nightmares, seizing and howling with each attack. She stood paralytic vigil, force-feeding him the herbs and poultice her grandfather had imparted so many moons ago. Yet with every sunset, it felt as if the ancient evil woven into her lineage carved another foothold in the withering man's psyche. As he clawed and gnashed, raving his eyes rolling back into blood-struck sockets, she knew the creature had dug its talons into his very animus. The lost hours of every sleepless night brought more hieroglyphs and banishing seals scratched into the beaten earth of the Hogan's floor. Sanctuaries whittled by exhaustion and resolve unwavering despite Marcus slipping further from her grasp. On the antepenultimate evening after twilight fell, something harrowing and skeletal finally slithered free from the banished domains to take up residence at the threshold. A moistureless scabbing and desiccated scales raked across beaten earth like serrated nails etching primordial runes into the firmament. The unmistakable stenches of ancient flesh rot and dried sage smoke clogged the air. Only Tori's own bloodline essence allowed her the higher vision to behold its crooked gait and hunched, anthropoid aspect, an insectal fusion of jutting femurs and pedicles whittled from the sandstone cliffs themselves. Alternating mantled limbs gripped and scythed from segments which ground open fissures with every lurching stagger. Yet nothing about its organic nature sequence could be comprehended as such by unawakened minds. The air warped and condensed at its slightest movements, rippling out visible distortions through the transdimensional membrane like an aqueous fluid reacting to the reality of its presence. All while its cyclopean compound scara rolled forth an endless pit of darkness deeper than the blackest cenote. Seemingly a sentient chasm crafted from the soulless vacuums of abandoned dwelling places and territories where the ancients paid their respects only to malign the sacred celebrants. So she greeted the Skinwalker inevitability upon that final dusk as predator and prey became one before the last gyre. The apertures within its well of dripping obsidian marring turned to reveal endless recursions and remotions swarming and pooling, a rendering of blasphemous panoramas depicting such incommunicable profundities and horrors that her own consciousness tried to reject and abort each defensive layer plumbed just by reflecting upon it. Only afterwards, when the graven seals were rewritten and cycles were once again eschewed, could Tori's lone self finally accept that revenant coming as inevitable, that the embodied overdue dissemination which had sought her regeneration across countless perpetuities. For as the anguished wails of Marcus' spirit became inaudible, she too awoke, and knew the call had only just begun. Little Isaac Begay always looked up to his Uncle Frank with a sense of awe and reverence. As the youngest son in a family of proud Navajo shepherds and craftsmen, Frank seemed to carry an innate spiritual wisdom far beyond his years. While the other men joked and gambled through their idle evenings around the humble Hogan fires, Frank spent his quiet hours practicing the ancient rituals, burning savory bundles of cedar and sumac, weaving intricate spirit plates, chipping delicate fetish carvings from gamboge and veined microgranites. One moonless night when Isaac was no older than 7 summers, his parents were wakened by a piercing scream from the outer grounds of the sheep corral. Rushing outside with a brand clutched for defense, his father stopped dead in his tracks at the sight of Frank convulsing in agony on the hard-baked earth. Isaac's uncle writhed and clawed at his own throat, eyes rolled back until only the bloodied whites were visible. A sickly green phosphorescence seemed to pulse and radiate from within his spasming body in grotesque waves. "He's been chosen," the wizened grandfather murmured in a grim tone, refusing to intervene despite the family's panicked pleas. "It is the way of the changeling skinwalkers to confer their tainted gifts upon our bloodline every few generations, like a pathogen's curse with no cure." Sure enough, when the seizing finally subsided, Frank's body lay still, smoke like tendrils of vapor slithering from his nose and mouth before condensing into the familiar burly visage once more. Yet Isaac could sense a haunting, unnatural vacancy about his uncle where the feverish gleam of devout spirituality once shone so brightly. From the depths of his own subconscious, the young boy somehow divined the insidious transference that had occurred. How a malignant presence, an ancient evil, had woven itself into the sacred rituals Frank practiced, infiltrating his soul like a cancer metastasizes through healthy tissue. In the aftermath of that unholy night, strange occurrences began plaguing the humble ranch in remote Hammond Canyon. Lambs were discovered bloodied and rent asunder in their birthing pens, bleeding in shrill agony until their tiny cries were abruptly silenced. Isaac's father claimed to have glimpsed shadowy shapes skulking amidst the scrubland labyrinth during his overnight vigils, twisted silhouettes that seemed to uncoil and slither just beyond the reach of the dancing bonfire's amber light. Yet whenever the family tried to broach the topic with Frank, he would only offer a soulless, thin-lipped smile and murmur vague reassurances about the property being under his protection now. His once inquisitive eyes now smoldered with a ferine, preternatural glow, devoid of any higher humanity. By summer's end, the family ranch began drawing concerned visitations from the neighboring tribal elders. After performing a series of elaborate rituals and divinations, the wizenchanters confirmed the unthinkable, one of their own, and willfully embraced the skinwalker's path, driven by ambition, vanity, and a desperate thirst for power. By violating the most sacred of obligations to walk embodying balance, beauty, and harmony, Frank had been possessed by the darkest and most feral essence of the Navajo chroniclers, a raving, two-legged beast fueled only by hunger, violence, and the call of carnal impulses. What ultimately befell Isaac's uncle and family is a horror story still recounted in hushed tones by the dying to this very day. A generational cycle of tragedy and brutality spawning from that fateful night when the skies opened and the UI was first allowed to taint their bloodline. For as was later discovered, once the skinwalker pathogen enters through the cracks of willful taboo and greed, it can never be altogether excised or contained. The cursed artifact is passed from one clan member to the next like a haunted heirloom, always lying dormant, waiting to be inadvertently awakened once more. For as long as he could remember, Cody Yazzie had suspected his family held dark secrets, the types of things the dying elders only dared whisper of in quietest dawn ceremonies when the world still lay shrouded in inky blackness. There were the unmistakable signs, of course. The way his parents and grandparents rigidly shunned all discussion about their ancestral bloodline and heritage. The hushed arguments overheard between furtive glances cast his way, drifting from behind the tattered rugs draped over the Hogan's entrance whenever the ritual relics and pouches were laid out. But most unsettling of all were the dreams, night terrors, really. Visceral visions of grotesque, hunched figures slavering through a realm of dust and dried arroyos beneath a withered, wan sky. Always hounding his spirit form from the periphery no matter which direction he fled, their scabrous hides of desiccated musculature and plate-jointed limbs slithering with unnatural boneless dexterity. The massive, misshapen skulls, reptilian jaws unhinging to release guttural, bestial roars brimming with bottomless hunger, these nightmares gripped Cody with a chilling sense of hyperreality more visceral than any waking experience. When he finally confided in his grandfather on his 18th birthday, the wizened old shaman went pale and mute before whispering the darkest of confessions. Their family harbored an ancient Navajo curse, a Pathogran infestation passed along for generations through the spiritual pathways of ceremonial shamanism. Sometimes it lay dormant for decades or even centuries, muffled by ritualistic chants and careful tradition. But every so often, they produced offspring like Cody, those gifted with an innate sensitivity to the supernatural, a higher perceptual awareness tying them to the eldritch realms just beyond our own mortal plane. Gifts that, if left unchecked by Singh teachings and strictest self-discipline, could allow the UI or the foul one to claw its way into their realm. Undeterred, Cody began studying the old family journals and tomes against his elders' warnings, finding them heavy with omens and coded warnings about engaging the way of the Kahalii, restless, vengeful spirits and ceremonial practitioners of Navajo witchery. While the others cowered in fear and whispers, he embraced their ancestors' ancient blood right with open arms. Soon, he could traverse between astral states at will, adopting the Tuatawi or shaman's alter ego to shapeshift and command improbable distortions of the physical and metaphysical worlds. No longer was he bound by constraints of gravity or biology. His form transmuted into gaseous seeds and corporeal plasma whenever he stalked the desert's vast solitudes. Coyotes and vultures scattered in abject terror from his passing. Granite boulders shuddered and danced from bass rumbles of his voice reverberating through the netherworld's elemental matrix. But with these newfound powers came an addictive craving for sustenance and insatiable hunger which could only be quenched by the spectral energies of living prey, consumed through another's unbridled fright and torment on the precipice of death. The listless wanderers, drifter junkies, and lost adventurers disappearing across the baked hard pans made for easy targets at first. But before long, Cody's gluttonous bloodlust could not be contained to the Badlands and lonely desert hills. As lightning storms raged ominous and the winds howled with anguished cries, the Night Stalker would stride the streets of Tadilakan and Sundagger, infiltrating homes and devouring the life essences of families right from their sweat-soaked, nightmare-tortured death throes. Some claim to have borne witness to the creature's true form, a massive, inchoate mass of coalescing ions and heatless plasma perpetually twisting into impossible, ever-shifting asymmetries like a malformed, cyberpunk kraken. Leviathan jaws of chromatic energy and soul-draining cores radiating pure existential dread. It was only a matter of time until Navajo Nation authorities were forced to confront the unspeakable evil rearing its abhorrent head across their sovereign lands, a tribally sanctioned expurgation of Cody Yazzi's tainted familial poison seed. They say the exorcism rites span a fortnight and shattered the skies with enough spirit-hexing maleficia to leave all nearby environs permanently scarred. And when the last embers of the ceremonial pyres finally blinked out, only a scorched, withered husk remained of the horror once free from human frailty's corporeal snare. Dr. Miriam Stokes was a woman of uncompromising science and logic. As the lead archaeologist supervising the Bottomlands ruin excavation in southern Utah's Navajo territory, she scoffed at her team's uneasy mutterings about ancient curses and malicious spirits lingering over their site. Never mind that 3 separate workers in as many days had to be evacuated from the remote dig location with severe panic attacks, hallucinations, and symptoms of heat stroke in the middle of frigid January. Or the strange, subterranean groaning vibrations that seemed to emanate from the deepest central chambers at night, audible across the entire buried Pueblo ruins. Miriam dismissed it all as psychological stressors compounded by isolated working conditions and native superstitions bleeding into rational perceptions. She expected better from domesticated academia types, not reckless, prima donna tantrums. Then came the night Aaron Yazzie failed to report from his western mapping station during the evening comms check. A thorough search the following morning turned up his wireless radio and tools lying beside a partially uncovered pit house, but no sign of the young Navajo man himself. Yazzie's tracks simply vanished in the middle of a desiccated arroyo bed 10 yards beyond the edge of the abandoned village. Based on soil disturbances and scuffled markings, his final footprints indicated a confusing shambling pattern, swinging wide as it violently spun around before lurching into erratic, high-paced strides toward the arid wastes beyond. Of even greater concern came the bloodwork analysis conducted by their on-site medical team upon further inspection of the disturbed arroyo floor where Yazzie's footprints ended. A muddled mixture of his blood spatter and unidentified genetic samples were found leading into a steep embankment where something heavy and dense had smashed down through the hardpan. The traces painted an unmistakable portrait. Aaron Yazzie had clearly met with some sort of large, powerful entity in violent struggle in the darkness. Yet there were no matching tracks or sign of where the body might have been dragged off, nor by what. Just that horrifically out-of-place biological material the lab specimens were refusing to identify or hypothesize their origin for. By the 7th night, as Dr. Stokes still held stubborn ground camp refusing to pull the evacuation order despite her team's anxious agitation, the Bottomlands ruins themselves seemed to awaken and exhale their own malicious intent. 2 junior Navajo diggers posted along the perimeter walkways dashed towards the camp center just as the evening dusk descended, breathlessly recounting their terrified witness of towering humanoid shapes emerging from the desert floor near the site's collapsed ceremonial kiva. Vile, skulking figures with elongated features and hunched, asymmetrical undulations weaving through the shadowed ravines and arroyos. Shortly after, the grating earth tremors and percussive echoes grew almost sentient in their rhythms, like gigantic heartbeats throbbing beneath their very feet. Daniel Chaco, the singer-runner who'd been dispatched to retrieve supplies from the SUV parking area a quarter-mile away, never returned despite repeated radio calls and roving spotlight sweeps. Out of water, power stores dwindling, and their morale shattered by the raw, primal dread of watching tenebrous horrors unfurl from the same primordial sands once tread by ancestral Puebloans. The crew huddled in a circle while Stokes remained steadfast in her resolve. Only when a skeletal, desiccated hand punctured through the hard-packed ground and wrapped its rotted tendons around her ankle did the respected academic's rational objectivity toward the inexplicable begin to collapse. For there in the writhing cloud of choke smoke, backlit by their swirling cressets, something coagulated and emerged from the abandoned underground ceremonial pits of the Anasazi's deepest, most esoteric summonings. A vile, distorted species of undying hunger and incorporeal hostility had staked its preternatural sentience upon this desecrated place of power for centuries untold. Now it reached up with gnarled, skeletal manifestations to reclaim possession of the defiled sacred lands so foolishly retrodden by Miriam's expedition of naive grave robbers. "Did you guys see that?" Marcus shouted, fumbling with his brand new Sony A7 camera as he tried tracking the bizarre movement through the viewfinder. Next to him, his girlfriend Ava rolled her eyes, looking up from furiously typing on her phone. "See what? The same lame-ass scrub brush and sand dunes as the last 3 hours?" Marcus swung the camera back towards their rented Jeep, zooming in on Ava's annoyed scowl. "No, babe, keep your eye on those buttes up ahead. Pretty sure I caught something slinking around on the move." She snorted derisively. "If you say so, babe." Just another CGI Skinwalker thumbnail failing to generate clicks for your channel's vapid content. That stung a little, but Marcus refused to let her withering sarcasm dull his excitement. They'd come all the way out to this isolated Utah desert stretch within Navajo Nation boundaries hoping to cash in on his channel's latest viral teaser stunt, getting undeniable photographic evidence of one of the infamous Yizo shape-shifting entities from indigenous folklore. And unlike most of the reality-contrived direct-clogging mainstream video platforms, this would all be 100% authentic, unrehearsed paranormal terror. No effects teams, no actress salaries, just them, their wits, and one absolutely terrifying evening spent capturing indigenous cryptids on camera. At least, that was the hope when they'd initially pitched their juggernaut influencer studio. Marcus just had to get the raw, undoctored money shots. Ava stared off towards the blurred silhouettes of gnarled juniper trees clinging stubbornly to a distant rock face. "I swear, if this is another half-baked bid for relevancy, we're so getting cancelled." She was about to continue her tirade when something low and sinuous slithered across the furthest ridgeline, briefly resolving into a spindly, elongated figure arcing against the sunset skyline before fading behind an Ocotillo patch. Marcus didn't need to prompt her this time. She jolted upright, makeup compact dangling from suddenly trembling fingers. Thumbing the focus ring till the curved, wavering shape filled his viewfinder, he steadied his breathing and slowly rotated the barrel mount to align the perfect tracking shot. Adrenaline burned through his veins, fueled by a mix of exhilarated dread and pure validation. "Oh my God, it's real. The legends are real," Ava whispered. "Keep rolling, keep rolling." Marcus dared glance over to where she was locked in a sweaty, rapt trance, breath suspended in her chest. He could practically hear her influencer marketing metrics hitting the stratosphere through sheer willpower alone. Then the guttural, bestial roars split the twilight like a thunderclap. Resonating chords of subharmonics rippling across exposed flesh and electrified synapses that transcended mere sound into a dimension of pure terror. Marcus' throat clenched as 5 distinct silhouettes unraveled from the spiny, desiccated tangle of foliage ahead. Serpentine necks craning above lean, desiccated torsos convulsing with predatory musculature. Raggedy boughs and twisted hardwood trunks seemed to unhinge and shed their bark cladding as grotesque, towering monstrosities straightened upright, shambling first with a halting cadence before breaking out into powerful loping strides. Hollow pits constituting their skulls remained locked unerringly on Marcus and Ava's frozen forms by the Jeep. The blood-curdling shrieks mounted to a feverish, unnerving pitch somewhere between a falcon's hunting cry and the tortured screams of burning animals. A weird, electromagnetic thrum trembled through Marcus' sternum, measuring the oscillating rhythm of his pounding heart rate. He couldn't breathe. He could barely even blink. Only his thumbs twitched on agonized spasms, gripping the camera body in a white-knuckle vice. Getting everything while losing his mind. The nearest shambler had closed half the distance in unnervingly quick bursts of shamanic speed, long arms trailing ragged ceremonial tassels and knotwork patterns which flowed like brackish water undulates rather than solid textiles. Ava finally found her high-wavering giggle again, muttering, "Oh God, this is big, this is so huge for us," like a hysteric mantra. But her eyes remained unreadable pits dredged by consummate dread. Then its debased, soul-blasted features erupted into a startling, hyper-accelerated blur across the camera's frame. Supermassive jaws wide enough to swallow Marcus whole filled the Viscomat viewfinder as those obsidian pits bored into him. He saw an eldritch spiraling eternity coiling amid the hellish moss depths, smelled the corrosive carrion tincture of its expelled breath. Its hybrid coyote/vulture rictus seemed to bend reality around its periphery with profane contempt for any whiff of mortal sentience. The celluloid horror froze just shy of consuming them in an implosion of entropic forces that elongated space-time. Marcus gradually became aware his body was no longer functioning properly. Ava's dying whimper barely audible over the dissonant metafrequencies blistering his eardrums. The skinwalker spectra seemed to be meta-reinforcing its own accrued presence, amplifying otherworldly signals as a chorus of screams overtook anything resembling visual or acoustic normalcy around them. By the time Marcus' bodily stasis relented and he felt his legs give out beneath him, expelling the contents of his stomach and vital fluids in a spasmodic purge, the seeker swarm had vanished into dark entropy without a physical trace. Overhead, the night sky blinked awake with newborn constellations as the desert swallowed them into its maw. Miles away, Ava's family would receive an anonymous stream modlink and high-res gallery dump with no explanation except Marcus' campfire husk and the fading cries of human terror forever meta-rendering. This is it, guys, the moment we've been waiting for. Pete Scorpion Baker crowed into his headcam mic, sweeping it across the austere southwestern scenery. After months of research and logistical planning, tonight we go headlong into the most harrowing hotspot of paranormal phenomena ever reported in the continental United States. Behind the camera's fisheye lens, the rest of Scorpion's cryptid hunting squad fanned out amongst the twisted sandstone buttes and labyrinthine arroyos. Triple reinforced off-road tires crunched coarse sand and arid hardpan under their methodical footfalls, kicking up thin veils of pale dust aureolas. We're here on Navajo Nation territory tracking what many consider to be the original, the primogenitor cryptid predator of the American West, Pete continued in his trademark raspy delivery. You've all heard the ancient legends of the skinwalkers, tales of malignant native shapeshifters and shamanic abominations passed down by the dying people for countless generations. Well, tonight, we're gonna get a good long look at the unholy truth. Motion-activated cameras studied the outcroppings and jagged rock faces encircling their expedition site, blanketing the neglected wilderness with false constellations of LED halos pulsing in unison with the perimeter sweeps. Nobody would take them by surprise on this hunt. The orange sandstone cliff at their rear commanded a formidable bulwark from any ground-based threats. Hunkered down in its dark shelves and dug in Precambrian crevices, the stakeout crew turned their rangefinders, thermals, and amplified imaging arrays outward to scour the bleak expanse of unforgiving terrain. For the next 48 hours we'll be camped right here in the Box Canyon labyrinth of Monument Valley Navajo Tribal Park, Pete narrated, ensuring the 360 chem drunk in every contour and undulating hardpan ridge. These foothills have harbored an unusually dense population of skinwalker sightings and eyewitness accounts over the past 2 centuries. Everything from cattle mutilations and ritual desecrations to outright attacks and coordinated stalking events. The dark fell like a cocked hammer across the eldritch wilderness valley. Swiftly the mercury dropped along with visibility, even combined thermo-optics practically swimming against the inky blanket of desert nightscape. Somewhere far off, a pack of coyotes erupted in spine-tingling song, their wails goading ribald answers from rival packs across the arroyo systems in a primal, echoing antiphony. Several times, solid black forms languidly flowed from crevice to bluff terminus in the crew's peripheral tracking arcs, stirring nerves until the moment passed only for another blur to catch their eyes minutes later. Night blindness, overstimulation, or something more purposely prowling, the first few hours dissolved towards midnight filled with nothing but tense jumpstarts and frazzled adrenaline buildups. Around 3 a.m., Amanda's Scorpion's junior recon wing began picking up strange aural frequencies over her hypergain parabolic radar dish. A low, forlorn murmuring purling across the unoccupied spectrum bandwidths, almost like snatches of corrupted speech or alien radio signals beamed from another plane of reality. Pete, her voice crackled over the encrypted teamcom circuit with more than just a hint of trepidation. It's starting again. Same deal as Pike's Peak, those voices, Jesus, they're getting clearer. Activating her body cam's infrared floodlight, Amanda swept back and forth across the bowl of darkness until her lens found purchase on a bizarre spectacle. There in the undulating dunes, not 50 yards from her position, something unnaturally humanoid yet utterly alien stood silhouetted in the emerald illumination. At least 8 feet tall even at its hunched posture, gnarled limbs bent and obscenely elongated, digits tipped with jagged protrusions that somehow blurred all attempts to bring them into focus. Matching its jerky, erratic lurches were spidery twitches of scorpion tails or mantis raptorials spasming from its torso at seemingly impossible geometries. And then, like a precision scope penetrating dense camouflage, Amanda saw its true face manifest amidst slowing planes of darkness and accretion of weightless shadows conjuring a vertical sonovoid, a sunken ellipse deformation vortexing anti-pupilled hungry eyes that blazed with penetrating spectra only a breath beyond infrared's meager reach. My God, she uttered into the buffkin silence in a strangled gasp. It's so much worse than I ever imagined. Static lace coordinates transmitted in digital code dredge across Scorpion's Nurjak teamcom, dispatching a dozen network killspots to her triangulated firing vectors in rotational sequence. Chemtracks and holoscopes veered perilously close before shattering against kinetic barriers erected in buzzing high-density ionized air currents swirling at increasing velocities around the towering antifocal mass. Amanda's remote perch split just as the heat rays zeroed in, detonating in a kiloton flash before enough ordnance cleared the kill safeguards to level any conventional opposition. Signals winked out as the wavefront disintegrated her station down to slag boulder remnants seated across a quarter-mile killing field. Fall back to Rally Sigma. I'll call fall back. Pete roared over backup command frequencies. But his parry feeds only conjured a phantasmal burr of entropic mistranslation strings humming the swan song dirges of uncounted species haunts blotted out across deep time. A singularity of ever-tightening death spirals invisibly enveloped and compressed the encircling topology into horizonless oblivion. The last glimpse any of them witnessed before non-existence swallowed their target override protocols was a starless schism of faint acritures and asymmetric topologies surrounding the ravenous space-time void, cosmogonic vectors unfurling from frameworks of skewed geometries beyond the wildest nightmares or Gnostic conception of the human mind. As for what manner of Ian's taunting, primordial malignancy ambushed Scorpion and his hunters deep within that unhallowed hellscape? What eldritch narcotic compulsions drew them forth to pierce those occult mysteries in the first place? Only the wordest of eldritch blasphemies guess, and forever mourn their failed transgression upon planes more sightless than even death's eremitic console. The winter of 1867 would be one spoken of in hushed tones by the few souls still clinging to the harsh existence along the isolated ridges and draws of the New Mexico Territory's Black Range Mountains. A season of dread portents and unshakable dread descending upon the tiny cluster of frontier homesteads like a smothering black mantle. For the Ramsey clan eking out their meager ranch along the icy precipices of Black Ridge, the first omens manifested in the mutilated carcasses of cattle and stock animals found strewn in sickening pieces across their upper grazing fields. Angus Ramsey, the family's grizzled paterfamilias, recognized the ungodly signs of something far more sinister than ordinary predator kills from the start. The thick slaughtering debris wasn't simply scattered in random explosions of violence, but carefully arranged in bizarre ceremonial patterns amidst strange symbols and grotesque fetishes crafted from split hides and bone shards. One fateful morning in early February, his two youngest sons Alex and Caleb set out to round up a few stray heifers which had wandered off into the protective woodlets surrounding their isolated homestead. When darkness fell with no sign of the boys' return, Angus mustered the few other able men from neighboring homes, old Eli Hawkins, his hunting partner Zeke, and the ranch's lone hired hand Miguel. By the pale moonglow reflecting off the fresh powder, they tracked the meandering cattle trails deep into the densely wooded ravine several miles out from the main Ramsey lands. There they found clear evidence of a terrible and unnatural struggle amid the trampled bracken and shattered tree limbs. Caleb's tattered coat and torn accessories caught on the brambles. Alex's hunting rifle blasted apart in two sections, scorched barrel still smoldering at the torn cyclone pattern blazoned into the frozen tree trunks all around. Yellow stains of congealed uric acid splattered everywhere, yet not a single drop of crimson. The few mangled bones discovered under rock outcroppings and hollow trunks seemed too large to be from cattle stock, their shafts snapped and fractured as if gripped and wrenched in massive jaws. Even more disturbing, their joints ended in wide flanges of ossified cartilage rather than any discernible human anatomical structure. Eli claimed to have glimpsed shambling strides pressed into the ridgeback drifts leading eastward into the high pine forest's black miasma. Something less than human and more than animal, the tracks fell in an uneven gait pattern suggesting the footfalls of a massive quadruped combined with a larger, more erratic parent trail slithering beside it in diseased curves and convulsions. Zeke and Miguel refused to follow any further once the blood-freeze winds picked back up, riled to their very cores by the distant, plaintive keening and baleful roars echoing from the unseen woods maw. Only Angus dared plunge ahead, his face cast in a 1,000-yard limit of rage and desolation as he intuited the full horror awaiting him beyond those eerie tree lanes. They say those who tried to follow the Ramsey patriarch deeper into those purgatorial haunts came staggering back before 2 nights' time, wills and constitutions shattered beyond any hope of reconstitution. Raving about crude, shifting geometries that wavered in and out of visual perception. Apertures of unknown wonder and disquieting anatomies from whence spilled amorphous, terrifying shapes. Mute testimony from the men recounted passages of flayed, unnameable tissue and skin merged with scabrous conformations like tree branches that pulsed with alien sentience. Scintillant, asymmetric topographies resolving into massive analogues of cosmic darkness and singularity, piercing into realities beyond our comprehension, leaving even the staunchest psyche forever petrified with glimpses of incalculable insanity. For the poor damned Ramsey boys, it seems their profane spirits had already been unmade by then. Bound within terror's capes of slithering scale-covered flesh bundles, sensory nerves enmeshed with regenerative sinew nodes to await only the most abhorrent abasement and piercing corruption, reconfigured into attached familiars and distended tendrils of the skinwalker spectre's grand design. When Angus Ramsey at last emerged a 10 nights later from the hellhole crypt of those haunted pines, his clothes were shredded and caked in frost. Hair and beard hung matted with congelation, gray features forever striated in rictus paralysis. Neither hunger, thirst, nor biting rock-slide wounds were registered as he dropped at the feet of his surviving family, gnarled fists brimming with desiccated slowings and wet tangos. His final words before expiring were gruesome predictions of the Uitsoo, the coming satanic renaissance and mass arrival of skinwalker sentience soon to envelop all lands of the southwest frontier. How their malignant spirits were destined to someday rise up and transform humanity into the long-awaited science of their true birthright. Angus' thrall-spoken death speech mercifully ended as the remnants of his psyche finally burned away. but not before uttering a blasphemous portent of what remained in store for all beings of wholesome flesh who dared encroach upon sacred grounds now reclaimed as blood territories of the skinwalkers' chaos unmaven brood. Hank Stover couldn't believe his luck when he landed the night security guard gig at Desert Diamond Casino just outside Tucson. The pay and benefits were great for the area, and he'd have the whole graveyard shift pretty much to himself while the gambling floors were closed down between 2 a.m. and 10 a.m. His first couple weeks on the job were pretty uneventful. He'd make his patrol rounds, grab a snack from the employee lounge, maybe catch an old movie on his laptop to pass the remaining hours until day shift arrived. Sure, the place gave off some weird vibes with all the Native American theming and hallway artwork. But the silence and solitude were a nice change of pace from his prior work at the mall. It was on his third week when Hank started noticing things. Strange sounds emanating from the vacant casino following the 2 a.m. lockdown. Faint rhythmic drum beats and guttural chanting, almost like ceremonial music, but distorted and warped in a way that set his nerves on edge. At first he thought it must be some automated native soundtrack piped through the PA system on a loop, but it had an eerie cadence that seemed to change and intensify the closer he roamed towards its source. Then came the shadows which appeared in his peripherals. Dark, hunched silhouettes that clung to walls and slots machine rose as Hank passed through the service corridors and gambling promenades. Mere suggestions of movement which faded back into blank corners whenever he shone his patrol wand upon them, only to rematerialize further along once he looked away. After a few restless nights of this, his unease blossomed into full-blown panic after reviewing the security cam footage. Hank could make out his own nightly patrols captured on the flickering green casino floor cams, but also those same shambling, emaciated ombre keeping pace in the background and just along the fringes of each frame. At first, they were fleeting and indistinct, smoky figures which only seemed to partially exist on this corporeal plane. But each successive traverse, the forms became increasingly defined and emboldened in their remorseless pursuit. Long, talon-tipped limbs trailing from withered torsos with distended rib cages swinging beneath leathery, desiccated flesh. Skulls elongated into muzzle-like visages of protruding obsidian fangs and hollow sockets dripping blackened ichor. By the next weekend, even the sight of those lurching, ambling entities on the CCTV monitors only hinted at supernatural obscenities now manifesting right before his eyes. It started just before his customary break around 5 a.m. At first, just the familiar sensations of being watched from dark recessed corners or stairwells beyond his vision. The droning ululations and woodwind-like trills undulating through the speakers in crescendoing waves. Growing louder and more frantic with each pass until Hank could no longer dismiss them as faulty acoustics or figments of an overactive imagination. When the first horrors breached from unseen dimensions right before his eyes, Hank was already paralyzed with adrenaline overload. Hunched, crackling shapes sliding forth from between slot machine rows, a procession of frayed, desiccated biomasses ambling erect on spindly legs, offshoots probing blindly ahead of them in dry clicking rails evocative of insectoid antennae. Epidermis stretched translucent over their skeletal torsos, if one could even classify those elongated rib cages and toothsome air sacs as deriving from anything approximating human anatomy. As for the sunken ebonies comprising their faces, the jagged protrusions surrounding those mewling rictuses could hardly be classified as any known vertebrate mandible array. But Hank wasn't able to ponder the eldritch geometries that comprised the entities much longer before charnel miasmas of foul bodily putrescence overwhelmed his nostrils and bowels. The dozen or so liches swiveled in unnatural unisons towards his location, hawing in an unholy chorus that blended screeching gusts of rancid vapor issuing from their abyssal gullets. Even once he managed to scramble away and trip the emergency alert, Hank knew deep down he'd never find sanctuary on this side again. Not after laying eyes upon the vilest scrivenments of hostile outer dimensions briefly unveiled within that ritualized casino's darkest recesses. For those sinews of the skinwalker's living nightmare had always dwelled within these lands, and those who once walked them epochs before, merely awaiting some foolish enough to finally trespass upon ground forbidden by all divine creation. "Oh, Jack, this place is absolutely breathtaking," Christina exclaimed as their rental SUV crested the final snowpack bend onto the picturesque Aspen Springs resort compound. Nestled amidst the towering pines and frosted alpine ridges of northern Arizona's White Mountains, the lavish ski lodge appeared practically a postcard-perfect winter wonderland. Thick blankets of pristine powder covered the sloping roofs and grounds, haze smoke puffing from river rock chimneys into the crisp evening air. Golden windows glowed with an inviting warmth, high vaulted beams of polished timber forming the skeleton for what appeared to be a cozy, rustic retreat. "Only the best for my beautiful bride," Jack replied with a wink as he pulled up to the main entranceway. Almost immediately, a smiling young Native American man in a heavy wool overcoat emerged from the lodge to greet them. His cheeks were ruddy from the harsh winds whipping through the valley, braided jet hair tucked under a thick stocking cap. "Welcome to Aspen Springs. I'm Kai, one of the resort butlers. Please, allow me to gather your belongings so you two can get checked in and warmed up inside." After they'd been shown to their luxurious private chalet suite, complete with a crackling fireplace and scenic balcony overlooking the sprawling slopes and pine forests beyond, Christina went about unpacking and settling in while Jack decided to go for an evening stroll. He buttoned his winter jacket up tight and headed out alone, following a winding path down to the outdoor hot spring grotto whose mineral-rich vapors had attracted the resort's very first patrons over a century ago. A fat round moon hung high in the star-studded sky, illuminating the small gathering gazebo adjacent to the steaming grottos where a few other guests sat enjoying the evening atmosphere. At least, that's what Jack assumed they were at first. There was something vaguely unsettling about the way the others were seated around the perimeter. Rigid, unmoving, almost as if frozen in a silent pagan ritualistic tableau. It made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle with nascent foreboding. As he took a few hesitant steps closer to investigate, Jack froze in his tracks up close. Their forms appeared twisted and elongated, like spindly wraith-like silhouettes sloughed beneath thick wool blankets. And as the nearest one angled its head slightly, he glimpsed a face that didn't look quite human. No, it was more an expressionless alabaster mask with sunken eye pits from which smoldered twin pinprick embers glaring from what felt like vast depths of profound, inscrutable hunger. As he met that vacantly hellish gaze, it was like his entire soul was momentarily exposed and cocooned in ice. Jack spun away at once, trying to tell his mind that the strange beings owed merely to unsettling shadows and shapes tricking his eyes. But first there came the sounds, a deep, ululating harmonics thrumming like multiple woodwind instruments blending into an earthy chordal pattern. He instantly realized it originated not from the lodges, but rather all around them in the darkness beyond the glow of the moonlit grotto. That's when the figures themselves began to shift their eerie poses. Rising in languid, almost liquefied motions onto splayed spindly legs. Canted triangular heads leaned forward, inch-wide jaws distending open on triple-hinged bone pyramids to reveal obsidian gullets lined with glistening curved fangs. From the surrounding darkness, more silhouettes emerged, their misshapen forms materializing out of the mossy snowdrifts and shielded copses. So many more than just the few seated at the grotto's perimeter, a countless procession slinking out of the White Mountains themselves. That's when Jack noticed their bone articulations and joint connections didn't simply flex, but flowed and snapped together with disconnected fluidity like stop-motion insectoid hybrids. Sections of plated torso armature expanding and contracting beneath rippling, cinereous cloaks of tattered fur and interwoven sinew mesh. The nearest towered easily 12 feet overhead, hooked prow of a skull balanced precariously upon a swan-like polymer curve of a neck corded in taut cables. Its mask sported a triangular, almost pyramidic visage contoured in rocky plates and niter extrusions from which those dual pinprick void lights flickered incandescent before descending on him. As the inhuman wails and chattering tongue trills echoed off the crystallized formations surrounding the grotto, Jack thought of Christina warm and safe back in their little cabin retreat. Completely unaware of the primordial nightmares even now awakening to surround and encircle the entire resort. The ones who'd been here all along, lying in torpor and ancient spiritual slumber until unsuspecting prey once more trespassed upon lands from which they'd been exiled ages before. The caravan of blacked-out SUVs barreled across the moonlit interstate cutting through the heart of the Navajo Nation reservation. On board were over a dozen figures clad in hooded robes, the men and women belonging to an elusive cult devoted to the most extreme and forbidden offshoots of occult masonry. In the lead vehicle, an older man known to his followers only as the Exalted briefed them via the crackle of encrypted radio channels. "Hear me, my children. Tonight marks the culmination of our centuries-long quest to restore glory and primordial power to our most ancient Western mysteries," he continued, voice taking on a transfixed, messianic fervor of zeal. "For too long have the old ways been allowed to wither and decay under siege from the weak faiths and false prophets of lesser mystery cults. Our worldwide society has been shackled and subjugated, dominated by the enslavers of science and materialism." Behind the wheel, the Exalted sullen driver checked their GPS coordinates before veering off onto an unmarked dirt path through a maze of austere natural buttes and humped sandstone formations. The fleet followed in tight formation down the twisting ravines and arroyos. "But all of that ends tonight," the Exalted howled, his voice now a vinegar rasp of unholy resonance. "For we ride forth on a glorious sacrament to consume the primordial power which has dwelt on these desert realms since before humanity's insignificant evolution." Parked in a tight semicircle in the heart of a secluded canyon basin, the robed cultists disembarked and began furiously erecting an impromptu ritual compound under the Exalted's supervision. Obsidian obelisks were hauled from hidden compartments in the vehicles and arranged in a precise arcane blueprint. Strange, sickly sweet herbal sachets were lit and hung from tripods to spill ribbons of pale violet smoke across crude effigies and occult diagrams etched into the hardpan surface. At the exact center, a deep recess had been dug out and lined with concentric circles of mirror-sheen black rock tiles. Only as his most zealous lieutenants began daubing sacrificial blood across the glyphs did the Exalted finally reveal what they traveled all this way to awaken and summon forth. "Yinal Luciai," he keened in a voice now distorted and inhuman beyond all recognition. "Zegishchin Anandai. Skinwalkers of the ancients, unholy denizens of the Navajo's blackest creation myths, we call you out from the abyss to reclaim this world." At his final reverberating command, all breath seemed to be siphoned away from the tightly confined ravines. The smoke froze in midair, suspended as if trapped within a vacuum of displaced space-time. Even the very air pressure seemed to fluctuate from inside their own tensing lungs. Then, with a sudden nauseating snap of atmosphere, as if two opposing hyperbolic wavefronts of dark matter just achieved nuclear singularity, a slithering bank of purple-black fog began seeping from every craggy overhang and stressed fault line surrounding the ritual site. The noxious miasma rolled forth in a distorted, amorphous wash to gradually melt and coalesce into a nexus. The Exalted held his arms skyward in gnarled claws, barking and howling indecipherable stanzas as the ever-churning cloud bank took on suggestive symmetries of alabrine extremities and cranial cavities set on pillar spines of condensed spiraling plasm. Like the idealized alien renderings of a bygone pulp sci-fi dimes how made raw and septic flesh. As fragmented silhouettes resolved into full-formed monstrous bestial shapes, the cultist's satanic conviction gave way to confused terror. Row upon row of gleaming compound ophidian eyes burned through the vapors, pebbly leathery hides sprouting eruptions of quilled hairs and prodigious rakes of serrated bone talons. The beings descended upon them in a waking phantasmagoria, distended jaws unhinging to release polyphonic cascades of eldritch shrieks, insectomaxillary compounds snapping and interleaving in fleshy cracks of inescapable fimbria. The exalted alone relished every moment, easily absorbing the displays of tentacle-raped geometries and sense-reaving cosmogonic horrors into his clairaudient synesthesia realms. Yes, yes, he rapturized in spiraling tones which graded the known auditory scale to bleeding hertz. At last the ancient skinwalker godmouths breached the stagnant birth of comprehended space. Let their ineffable waveform transmigrations unmake all realities chained to your piteous species' putrescent flesh wreaths. By dawn's first creeping rays, nothing remained of the Satanists' underground sect or their ceremonial implements save for pulverized fragments and sanity-scouring coagulations no rational eye could bear to linger upon. And the horror at last freed, forever loose to infiltrate and consume from within our most hallowed physical constants. All thanks to ego's most reckless of ambassadors once again. The plans for the Canyon Ridge pipeline had been meticulously surveyed and approved after years of environmental assessments. The 500-mile conduit would transport crude oil from the prolific Permian Basin in Texas all the way to refinery terminals in northern Arizona. While the majority of the pipeline's path cut through remote federal lands and private ranches, one 20-mile stretch was slated to traverse a particularly sensitive stretch of Navajo Nation territory known as Black Mesa. Despite protests from native conservation groups, threats of lawsuits, and even government negotiation attempts, Campo Energy Solutions remained undeterred from its intended course. For the construction crews tasked with the formidable challenge of burrowing their machinery in tonnages of steel piping through the harsh, unforgiving mesa landscapes, it was just another notch in their belts. Hardened men and women long accustomed to pushing through hostile environments on America's fossil fuel frontier. But almost from the moment their convoy rumbled into the secluded Black Mesa approaches last August, an unmistakable sense of dread and inexplicable phenomena began to plague the entire operation. It started small at first, minor gear malfunctions, or pieces of heavy equipment being found nowhere near their documented parking zones overnight. Strange tread marks and impressions turned up in dirt berms and hard-packed soil where no vehicles could possibly have traversed. Then it escalated into larger manifestations that no one could easily dismiss. Entire segments of pipeline tracks being knocked askew or bent into improbable angles as if struck by a massive object. Steel stanchion bolts scattered like gravel across 100-yard radiuses, their weight and mass defying any sort of typical machinery mishap. Massive trenches and dugouts, some over 10 feet deep, appeared out of nowhere between shifts with nary a whisper of earth mover or backhoe activity. All eventually attributed to unexplained soil liquefaction by the on-site environmental consultants. The first incident to make national headlines involved the appearance of over 100 mutilated calf carcasses found strewn at the far eastern boundary of the site. The half-buried bodies were missing large portions of flesh and bone material, most of their soft tissue cavities neatly cleared out with disturbing precision. All of the currently accepted predator suspects, including Mexican wolf packs and rogue grizzly bears, were immediately dismissed as incongruent with the kill's surgical slaughter patterns. More disturbingly, the remaining calf hides and skeletal chunks had been intricately arranged into a series of ancient symbols and petroglyphs, their chilling meanings unknown to anyone outside the most isolated Navajo or Metic sects. The final grisly encounter happened just last month as Campo crews labored through the final stages of pipeline road construction. In a remote box canyon en route to the Arizona terminal nexus, a trio of veteran pipeliners came across what they first mistook as another crew's impromptu campsite. That is, until they realized the strange wigwam structure at the center had been constructed entirely from desiccated human remains lashed together by scraps of tendon and rawhide. Police hazmat teams were immediately dispatched to secure the area after Navajo authorities caught wind of the macabre scene. What they discovered upon site arrival, thankfully restricted from any leaked video coverage, can only be described as the unmistakable remnants of a profane, inhuman summoning rite that had clearly tapped into primordial, cosmic malignancies beyond mortal ken. Any additional crews deployed to the accursed Black Mesa pipeline have respectfully declined to share their experiences on record. but one anonymous worker was overheard telling a hitchhiker headed east on I-40 about hearing them sometimes when the wind shifted weird out on the mesas. Like shrieking animal calls and tribal chanting, all blending together into some ungodly choirmaster's symphony. Needless to say, Campo Energy shelved any further plans for expansion in those desecrated lands. All evidence of their former pipeline dream already being swallowed up by the drifting sands, leaving only faint indentations and gaping wounds as the sole reminders of humanity's transgressions against what lies waiting underneath. The convoy of army vehicles rumbled southward through the desolate desert stretches of the Navajo Nation on its way to a training exercise near Fort Huachuca, Arizona. Thick clouds of reddish-brown dust billowed in their wake as the HMMWVs and armored transports bounced along the isolated two-lane highway. Corporal Shane McKinley sat cramped in the gun turret of the 3rd Humvee, sweat stinging his eyes as he scanned the austere mesas and rock formations flanking their route. Hours of monotonous unseen terrain had lulled him into a trance-like torpor. Something up ahead caught his eye, a glint of sunlight reflecting off a metallic object in a shallow ravine sequestered between two eroded ridgelines. As the convoy drew nearer, McKinley was able to make it out clearly. "Hey Sarge, you might want to take a look at this," he called down to the crew compartment. "Looks like some kind of ceremonial artifacts or ritual pieces scattered in that gully." The convoy slowed as their vehicle drifted closer to the strange debris field. Composed of an assortment of rusted blades, feathers, and arcane fetish sculptures, the artifacts radiated an unsettling presence even to the most hardened and jaded grunts. Sergeant Chambers peered through his field binoculars, sweeping across the ravine's ragged contours. "You're right, Corporal. Definitely ritual items of some sort. I'd wager Native American from the look of them." McKinley narrowed his eyes as something else emerged into his crosshairs. At the edge of the gully, barely visible beyond a clump of scorched Joshua trees, sat a crude wooden structure capped with a peaked roof, a traditional Navajo hogan dwelling. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he spotted a humanoid figure crouched in the hogan's entrance, completely still and faced in their direction almost expectantly. Even at this distance, McKinley's instincts registered an aura of malign sentience behind those unblinking features. "Heads up, we've got possible city contact up ahead. Might have been a hiker or nomad camp that got disturbed by our approach," Chambers radioed ahead to the leading vehicle. He turned back towards the gunner's hatch with a casual shrug. "Better not spook the locals by getting too close with our stuff all sprawled out. Gun it and let's get past this area, Corporal." But the moment their Humvee lurched forward and pulled away from the ravine, McKinley felt a prickling awareness in the air around him, a slightly electrical ionization raising the arm hairs under his uniform sleeves. He shook off the weird sensation with a flex of his shoulders. It wasn't until they made camp further south that anything seemed overtly amiss. The sun had just set over their isolated convoy position among the red mesas when the perimeter watch sounded an alert, disquieting vocalizations unlike any indigenous wildlife calls echoing through the shallow canyon approaches. Over the radio net, uneasy sentries reported glimpsing bizarre silhouettes and dancing shadow shapes flickering just beyond their night vision scope's visibility ranges. Crude scratchings and uneven cadences almost akin to inhuman laughter or chanting, albeit distorted into gurgling staccato rhythms that set everyone's nerves on edge. As the supernatural occurrences escalated overnight, vehicle sensors blaring at thermal hot spots converging upon them, communication systems glitching with electromagnetic interference, dread quickly metastasized into full-blown terror. Something ancient and undying had taken root all around them, its unspeakable geometries awakening from primordial slumbers. By morning's first light, the entire 60-man platoon found themselves in a state of panic pandemonium. Several troops suffered catatonic fugue episodes, vegetative and non-responsive as vacant flesh puppets. Others grew violently unhinged, clawing at their own faces and twisting their limbs into unnatural contortions with inhuman strength until fitfully expiring. The few left with wits intact could only brace against the escalating extra-dimensional chaos. As massive, hulking shadows with elongated, sauroid skulls loped into view from the low dune ridges, unleashing warbling calls and cries heard in humanity's oldest fevered dreams. Their monstrously sentient pursuers all converging from the Hogan's initial desecrated coordinate. Skinwalkers answering the blood summons of their most irreverent trespassers. For centuries, the Navajo people have passed down tales of terrifying evil spirits and malevolent forces lurking just beyond the veil of the corporeal world, the Inallushii, or skinwalkers as they became known. Shamanic witches and demonic tricksters who could transform into nightmarish animal-human hybrids and prey upon the weak of spirit and body. While many outsiders dismissed these legends as mere cautionary folklore, the Dain understood that the threat of skinwalker manifestations was always simmering under the surfaces of their tribal lands. An ever-present specter lying in wait for opportunities to breach the boundaries and feed upon human malice and desecration. Which is why the most spiritually attuned Hatathli medicine men kept eternal vigil, performing ancient rituals and protective ceremonies to maintain the sacred balance. For they knew the unsettling truth that every few decades, the skinwalker forces would awaken with a ravenous insatiability. Their vile, shape-shifting presences rippling into reality to infest and taint the land and its people like a virus. The last such event, known as the Nanahuka cycle, had occurred in the late 1980s across the western mesas of Black Creek Valley. For over 2 years, a miasma of paranormal dread clung to the arid stretches, as if the very air itself had taken on a sickly, corpse-like malignancy. Isolated ranchers and sheepherders from those parts spoke of hearing demonic laughter and untranslatable chanting on the night winds, punctuated by the anguished death cries of animals. More than once, search parties ventured into the valley's gnarled arroyos and drainages only to be driven back by overpowering stenches and sensations of pure primordial malice beyond sane comprehension. It was as if visible reality itself took on a fluid, warped geometry during that grim cycle. Shadows shifting and elongating in sickening defiance of natural laws. Visions of lurching, upright figures glimpsed slinking in rock crevices and lightning-blasted outcroppings, their bodies twisted into poses between biped wolf and emaciated hominid. All culminating in the final weeks before the cycle drew to a close, when the missing residents, cattle mutilations, and bait howls drifting in from the wilderness crescendoed to a nightmarish fever pitch. Only the most primally seasoned Hatathli shamans dared set foot across those menace-laden horizons with ritual fervor and expurgation rites. It was fortunate the preparatory Navajo singers had already spent months reinforcing the ceremonial boundaries and concocted the strongest antidote herbs and fetishes. For the sheer, mind-shredding immensity of Nanahuka's skinwalker manifestation that sprang forth bordered on the cosmically apocalyptic. An ancient, world-devouring hunger forced back into dormancy by the narrowest of talismans and faith's most resilient of chains. And now, as the millennia turns and old cycles prepare to rotate anew, those scattered across the Navajo nation's mystic enclaves can feel the wind stir with foreboding resonance. Goat-headed wraiths and flayed, anthropoid silhouettes dance across the thornbush silhouettes cast by dying campfires. Chilling howls resonate with a sinister cadence not entirely terrestrial carry through the canyons and bluffs, calling the most spiritually lucid to assemble their masks and ritual pouches. For the Nanahuka cycle stirs once more beneath the hallowed mesas, awaiting the sacred moment to emerge into their birthright of skinwalker dominance over the outer plains. To the remote residents of Bitsai and Iquias, nestled along the sandstone mesas and shallow arroyos of Arizona's Navajo Nation, Thomas Kismuller was a beloved figure. The grizzled 83-year-old sheep herder spent his days wandering the austere scrublands, guiding his flock across the arid expanses with an intuitive connection to the barren yet sacred landscapes. Even the most guarded Anglo Ranch hands and uranium miners from the neighboring towns respected Grandpa Kizzy's preternatural abilities. How he could locate water sources and pinpoint his herd's locations with little more than dowsing sticks and the lay of the wind. Some attributed it to hereditary intuitions passed down over ancestral Navajo generations. Others whispered about Kismuller possessing a deeper, ceremonial bond with the land itself. But none could have anticipated the horrific revelation that would befall Bitsai and Ikias like a curse from the most malevolent skinwalker specters. It began during the summer drought month when Kismuller's herds started wasting away in unsettling fashions. Entire clusters of lambs, kids, and ewes were found dead across the grazing plateaus with unseasonable frequency. Their meatless carcasses brittle and desiccated in ways that went beyond simple dehydration and starvation. While their bones were picked curiously clean, patches of wool and tufts of skin adhered to their empty hides and coagulated scabs, as if their bodies had been reduced to shriveled husks through some exotic wasting ritual no coyote could perform. When rangy cougars and the occasional starved grizzly were ruled out, many chalked up the disturbing anomalies to curse tales and skinwalker lore, which only deepened the community's collective dread when half-devoured sheepdog carcasses turned up amidst the massacre, their skulls shattered and rib cages pried open as if by massive, bestial jaws and curved talons. The younger ranch hands patrolling the outer grazing boundaries often started hearing things, disembodied howls and piercing shrieks carrying across the mesa tops that sounded nothing like their typical coyote and fox calls. Unnerving presences seemed to lurk just beyond eyeshot, looming with malign sentience over the shadows of dry washes and scrub-choked ravines. Many swore they witnessed shapes and elongated figures constantly tracking their movements from the peripheries at dusk, only to vanish behind erosion-carved outcroppings, always keeping tandem with Kismuller's meandering herds as if engaged in some covert, territorial stalking parallel to the old shepherd's own flock. It all finally came to a tragic head during the annual Butchering Moon Festival, where the tight-knit outpost celebrated the end of autumn's cullings. As the elders, families, and ranch staff convened around the ceremonial fire pit to commence the symbolic harvest bonfire under a swollen hunter's moon, they noticed Kismuller's conspicuous absence. None had seen the elder shepherd in over a week. Search parties fanned out across the rugged highland slopes as a sense of disquiet settled over Bitsai and Ikias. Those God-fearing Christians gripped their Bibles and crosses tightly, silently praying their circuit might bypass whatever evil had evidently descended upon their home. But the Navajo scouts, having been immersed in skinwalker portents and resentful UI legends since infancy, felt a more primordial sense of panic gripping their beings. They recognized the macabre symbols and ritualistic fetishes marking the trail followed by Kismuller's sunken footprints leading into the labyrinths of slick rock defile and chokingly tight basalt box canyons. It was almost a full lunar cycle before the blood-curdling howls and tormented wails finally drew them to the old Anasazi ruins overlook its low, recurved alcoves and fallen sandstone walls caked in centuries of dust and bat guano. They fanned out with weapons raised, sickened by the stench of charred flesh and rotting wool wafting up from the shadowy antechamber beneath. There they discovered the remains, and the creature. Unspeakable signs of nightly rituals and sacrifices that dated back months, possibly years based on the fouled, unholy wakes strewn about the ceremonial hearths. At the center writhed the thing conjured from their darkest spirit legends. Withered musculature and desiccated flesh woven into a bestial, werewolf-like silhouette leering up at the newcomers. Its fangs and claws were clearly evolved for hybrid wolf and beak fusion, elongated muzzle and maw bristling with quills and tattered ceremonial fetishes like some dark effigy. With a contemptuous shriek, the skinwalker shaman snapped a final spinal rune from Kismuller's sun-bleached skeleton. Flesh melted away from the fiend's face as an atavistic shamanic shift overcame its hell-spawned essence. Its howl drowned out by the sonic onslaught of centuries-old rage unleashed upon those who breached the sanctum. When the dust settled over the old Anasazi cairn once more, the scouts lay strewn in bloodied, tattered heaps. Some fatally torn and eviscerated in the skirmish, others gurgling up black ooze from unknowable psychic rapes beyond any merciful trauma. Forever haunted by what the lucky survivors had glimpsed lurking within Kismuller's prized herds and hellish night-riding circuit beneath countless indifferent desert moons. The rusty welcome sign, once a vibrant turquoise, now on limp against the weatherwood post, its message a faded whisper, Sail Peacekeeper Monument 5 miles. Sarah gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, the desolate landscape of the Navajo Nation stretching endlessly before them. They'd been assured the detour wouldn't add much time, but the sun was beginning its descent, casting long, ominous shadows across the red rock formations. Beside her, her husband, David, scrolled through his phone, his brow furrowed. GPS must be acting up again, he muttered. Says there should be a turn-off here, but I don't see anything. Their teenage daughter, Emily, sighed dramatically from the back seat. Seriously? Lost in the middle of nowhere? This is the worst road trip ever. Sarah forced a smile. We'll find our way, honey. It's just an adventure. Her own voice, however, lacked conviction. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the tires on the dusty track. Then, a flicker of movement in the rearview mirror caught Sarah's eye. A lone coyote, its fur an unnatural shade of gray, trotted parallel to the car for a moment before disappearing behind a jagged rock outcrop. She shivered, attributing it to the setting sun and the growing sense of unease. As dusk deepened, the temperature plummeted. The air hung heavy, thick with an unsettling stillness. The car's headlights barely pierced the encroaching darkness, revealing only a desolate canvas of sand and scrub brush. Suddenly, a sickening thud echoed from the undercarriage. The car lurched and sputtered, then died completely. David swore under his breath, fumbling with the ignition. Panic clawed at Sarah's throat. They were stranded, miles from civilization, with a teenage daughter who was already on the verge of a meltdown. As David popped the hood, his silhouette cast a grotesque shadow in the fading light. Hours crawled by. David's attempts to fix the car proved futile. The silence was shattered only by the eerie howl of a distant coyote, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. The temperature seemed to drop further, and a bone-chilling wind picked up, whispering secrets through the dry brush. Under the blanket of a star-studded sky, they huddled together for warmth, a gnawing fear settling in their gut. Then, in the distance, they saw it, a flicker of light. Hope surged through them. Sarah scrambled to her feet, grabbing their emergency flashlight. As they approached the light, their hearts pounded with anticipation. It emanated from a small, dilapidated cabin, its windows glowing a warm yellow. Relief washed over them as they reached the weathered wooden door. Sarah knocked tentatively. The silence stretched. Just as they were about to turn away, a creak echoed from within. The door swung open a crack, revealing a pair of eyes, dark and watchful, peering out from beneath a shadowed face. The figure remained silent, the only sound their own ragged breaths. A primal fear, cold and suffocating, gripped them. The light from the window flickered once, then extinguished, plunging them back into darkness. Sarah stumbled back, a whimper escaping her lips. They exchanged panicked glances. This wasn't a haven, it was a terrifying unknown. Turning on their heels, they retreated back to the car, the sound of unseen footsteps crunching on the gravel sending chills down their spines. The night wore on, a relentless symphony of unsettling howls and unseen movements keeping them awake. Just as the first rays of dawn painted the horizon, the engine coughed back to life. Relief washed over them like a tidal wave. They didn't waste time investigating the strange cabin. With trembling hands, David steered the car away from that desolate place, the image of the dark, watchful eyes seared into their memory. They eventually found their way back to civilization, a shaken but grateful family. The events of that night remained a chilling secret, a constant reminder of the lurking darkness that can exist even in the most unexpected places. The detour may have added miles to their journey, but it left them forever marked by the unseen terror that stalked them in the heart of the Navajo Nation. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as the four friends trekked deeper into the canyon. Spring break was supposed to be a carefree escape, a chance to explore the rugged beauty of the desert's southwest. But for Aaron, Mike, Sarah, and Ben, their enthusiasm had waned, replaced by a nagging sense of unease. Their GPS had died hours ago, and the towering sandstone cliffs seemed to close in on them, each twist of the trail revealing no sign of the marked path. Maybe this wasn't the best idea, Aaron muttered, wiping sweat from her brow. We should probably turn back before it gets dark. Mike, the self-proclaimed leader, scoffed. Relax, drama queen. We'll find the trail eventually. Besides, this is way cooler than some crowded beach. Suddenly, Sarah, a history buff with a fascination for Native American cultures, gasped. Tucked away in a secluded alcove, partially obscured by windblown sand, stood a cluster of ancient stone structures. Intricate carvings adorned the weathered walls, whispering tales of a long-lost civilization. Excitement replaced apprehension. Guys, look at this. This is incredible. Sarah exclaimed, rushing towards the ruins. The others followed, their initial awe quickly morphing into a creeping sense of foreboding. The silence within the structures felt heavy, suffocating, as if unseen eyes watched their every move. As they explored further, Sarah brushed her hand against a smooth, cool surface. A barely audible click echoed through the chamber, followed by a faint rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The friends exchanged nervous glances, the hairs on their necks prickling. The rumble intensified, morphing into a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the very ground. Panic seized them. They scrambled back towards the canyon entrance, hearts pounding in their chests. Reaching the opening, they were met with a chilling sight. The previously clear path had vanished, replaced by a labyrinth of towering rock formations they hadn't seen before. The canyon itself seemed to have shifted, twisted, mocking their escape. Terror fueled their legs as they sprinted in a random direction, the guttural growls echoing behind them. They stumbled through the maze of sandstone, the air thick with a suffocating dread. Just when they thought they couldn't run any further, they emerged into a clearing bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Relief washed over them, but it was short-lived. In the center of the clearing stood a lone figure, tall and gaunt, its shadowed face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. An unsettling stillness surrounded it, an unnatural stillness that seemed to defy the desert wind. The figure tilted its head, and a cold, rasping voice slithered through the air. Welcome to my domain. As the friends huddled together, their eyes wide with terror, the figure took a step forward, and the ground beneath its feet shifted, revealing a pair of cloven hooves. A horrifying realization dawned on them. This wasn't a random encounter, they had unwittingly awakened something ancient and malevolent, a creature of legend, the skinwalker. The last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, plunging the clearing into an inky blackness. The guttural growls intensified, circling them with a promise of unspeakable terror. The friends stood frozen, their screams swallowed by the vast, unforgiving desert night. The fate of the college students remained a chilling mystery, a cautionary tale whispered among park rangers and seasoned hikers. The ancient ruins stood silent, a monument to their unwitting trespass, and a stark reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the sun-baked sands of the American Southwest. The whispers started subtly. Late at night, nestled in their luxurious cabin at the exclusive Desert Bloom Resort, Amelia swore she heard the guttural chanting emanating from the distant mesas. John, ever the pragmatist, dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on the adobe walls. But the unease persisted. During their hikes, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The ravens, usually bold, seemed unnervingly close, their obsidian eyes fixed on her with unsettling intensity. The once vibrant Navajo rugs that adorned the resort halls felt inexplicably cold under her touch. The staff at Desert Bloom was unfailingly polite, yet a strange coldness radiated from them. Their smiles seemed forced, their eyes vacant. One evening, Amelia witnessed a young waitress, Sarah, whom she befriended earlier, staring into the fire, muttering in an unknown language. When Amelia approached, Sarah's face contorted in a flash of fury before returning to its vacant expression. John, however, remained oblivious. He reveled in the peace and quiet, attributing Amelia's anxieties to honeymoon jitters. But one morning, the resort's tranquility shattered. A blood-curdling scream pierced the pre-dawn silence. Rushing to the source, they found a maintenance worker, gibbering incoherently, his eyes wide with terror, pointing toward the ancient burial mounds on the resort's periphery. Ignoring Amelia's pleas to call the authorities, John, fueled by a misplaced sense of adventure, insisted on investigating. Amelia, fearing the worst, reluctantly followed. As they drew closer, the chanting grew louder, a rhythmic, primal pulse that sent shivers down Amelia's spine. The mounds, once a serene sight during their hikes, now reeked of something foul and decaying. Fear cemented Amelia's suspicions. The skinwalkers, malevolent spirits of Navajo legend, had infiltrated the resort. Suddenly, Sarah, clad in a ceremonial robe she'd never worn before, emerged from behind a mound. Her once kind eyes glowed with an unnatural orange light. She spoke in a raspy voice, no longer the sweet girl Amelia knew. "This land does not belong to you," she rasped, her voice carrying on the wind. "It belongs to us. Now, leave, or join the others." John, finally acknowledging the danger, grabbed Amelia's hand and pulled her back. They sprinted towards their cabin, the chanting and inhuman shrieks echoing behind them. John locked the door, but the flimsy wood did little to quell the rising panic. The next morning, fleeing for their lives, they stumbled upon a park ranger patrol. Amelia, her voice trembling, recounted their ordeal. The rangers, though skeptical at first, grew increasingly concerned with each detail. Desert Bloom Resort was mysteriously shut down shortly after. The official report cited structural concerns. But Amelia knew the truth. The place had been overrun by malevolent spirits, a chilling reminder that some legends are best left undisturbed. Years later, Amelia and John remained haunted by their experience. The chanting, echoing in their dreams, served as a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the beauty of the Southwest. The rusty gate creaked open with a groan, protesting Wyatt's intrusion. He gripped the recorder tighter, the familiar weight a source of comfort in the vast emptiness of the Navajo Nation reservation. His phone, with its depleted battery, mocked him from his pocket. No signal, no escape route. Wyatt, a self-proclaimed urban legend investigator, had chased countless stories, his booming voice captivating thousands on his podcast, Whispers in the Dark. But the Skinwalker legend, a shape-shifting creature said to lurk in the Navajo Nation, held a different kind of allure. It wasn't just folklore. There were documented reports, eyewitness accounts that sent shivers down your spine. He'd secured reluctant permission from a local elder, a man named Hastian, to record the strange happenings near an abandoned mine. Hastian's words, laced with a deep-seated fear, had chilled Wyatt more than any online rumor. The setting sun cast long, menacing shadows across the desolate landscape. As Wyatt shouldered his backpack, a flock of crows erupted from a nearby canyon wall, their dark forms blotting out the fading light momentarily. A shiver ran down his spine, but he dismissed it as nerves. Following Hastian's cryptic directions, he navigated the treacherous terrain, the air growing colder with each step. Then, he saw it, the abandoned mine shaft, a gaping maw in the earth, its rusted machinery skeletal against the dying light. As Wyatt approached, the recorder felt heavy in his hand. He pressed record, his voice shaky but determined. "This is Wyatt, live from the reported hotspot of skinwalker activity." Silence. an unnatural silence that pressed against his eardrums. He scanned the area, the shadows deepening, playing tricks on his mind. Just then, a low growl reverberated from the depths of the mine shaft. It wasn't a sound an animal could make, it was primal, guttural, and infused with an ancient evil. Wyatt's breath hitched. He fumbled with his flashlight, its beam a weak defiance against the encroaching darkness. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by a metallic scraping sound. Panic clawed at his throat, the weight of his earlier bravado a crushing burden. Then, a figure emerged from the mine shaft. It was humanoid in shape, but grotesquely distorted. Its skin, an unnatural shade of gray, stretched taut over an emaciated frame. Its eyes, devoid of iris or pupil, glowed a malevolent red in the darkness. Wyatt stumbled back, the recorder clattering to the dusty ground. The creature tilted its head, the clicking sound of bone on bone sending a fresh wave of terror through him. It didn't move towards him, just stood there, watching. And then, the most terrifying thing happened. The creature began to shimmer. Its form wavered and distorted, morphing into something else entirely. A coyote. A monstrous coyote, its eyes burning with the same unholy red light. Wyatt's mind reeled. This wasn't a legend, it was a living nightmare. He turned to flee, but his legs refused to obey. The creature, no longer a coyote but a chilling amalgamation of shadows, let out a bone-chilling shriek that tore through the silence of the night. The last thing Wyatt registered was a sense of overwhelming dread, a chilling certainty that his story would never be told, his voice forever silenced in the vast emptiness of the desert night. The recorder lay abandoned, its red blinking light the only witness to the horror that unfolded. Whispers in the Dark never saw another episode. The legend of the Skinwalker remained, a terrifying reminder of the darkness that lurks beyond the veil of reason. Dr. Evelyn Walsh squinted at the newly unearthed petroglyph, its intricate spirals and jagged lines contrasting with the ochre-colored sandstone cliff. A thrill of discovery coursed through her. This wasn't just any dig, it was a potential gateway to rewriting history, a forgotten civilization buried beneath the sands of the Navajo Nation. But the excitement was laced with a growing unease. Strange occurrences had plagued the excavation since its inception. Tools went missing, replaced by eerily similar ones crafted from unknown materials. Coyotes, normally skittish, would circle the camp at night, their glowing eyes unsettling even the most seasoned archaeologists. Then came the dreams. Vivid nightmares that felt more real than reality, filled with chilling whispers in a language that tugged at the edges of Evelyn's memory. Dreams of a hunched figure with glowing red eyes, guarding a secret too terrible to be unearthed. One evening, as the exhausted team huddled around the crackling campfire, their Navajo guide, Tsay, spoke in a hushed voice. This land holds stories older than time, stories not meant for outsiders. His weathered face etched with worry. Perhaps we should leave it be. Evelyn, fueled by scientific curiosity, dismissed his concerns. We're close, Tsay. Uncovering a civilization lost to time is too important to give up now. The next day, the unearthing intensified. The petroglyphs led them towards a hidden chamber, its entrance sealed with a massive stone slab. As the team strained to move it, a guttural growl echoed through the canyon, sending shivers down their spines. The growl morphed into a chilling shriek, and a monstrous figure emerged from a hidden crevice. Tall and gaunt, with skin like stretched leather and eyes burning red, it radiated an otherworldly evil. In an instant, they knew the whispers were true. The Skinwalker, guardian of the ancient secret, had awakened. Panic seized the team. They scattered, the creature's unnatural speed making escape impossible. It wasn't interested in bloodshed, but in silencing their intrusion. Tsay, facing the creature head-on, chanted in his native tongue, a desperate plea to appease the enraged spirit. The chanting seemed to have an effect. skinwalker paused, its eyes flickering between Say and the trembling archaeologists. Then, with a final ear-splitting shriek, it vanished into the desert air, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. The team, shaken but unharmed, knew they couldn't stay. Say's words echoed in their ears. This wasn't just an archaeological dig, it was a trespass on sacred ground. With heavy hearts, they packed up their equipment, leaving the buried chamber untouched. News of the accidental collapse of the dig site spread through the archaeological community, but Evelyn kept the truth hidden. The nightmares, however, refused to fade. The chilling whispers continued, a constant reminder of the horrors they had witnessed and the ancient secrets best left undisturbed. The skinwalker, she knew, remained vigilant, a chilling guardian of a darkness forever shrouded in the sands of time.